The Laer emerged as one of the galaxy's most sophisticated xenos civilizations during the closing millennia of the Dark Age of technology, establishing their dominion across multiple star systems within the purged sector. Their homeworld of Laeran became the beating heart of an empire that would eventually span dozens of worlds, each terraformed and cultivated to suit their unique physiological requirements. The planet itself existed as a testament to their mastery over biological manipulation, its surface transformed into vast networks of living cities that pulsed with organic architecture grown rather than built. Archaeological evidence recovered by Imperial forces suggests the Laer evolved from primitive serpentine creatures inhabiting the deep ocean trenches of Laeran's primordial seas. Over millions of years, these early ancestors developed sophisticated neural networks that allowed for complex problem-solving and eventually tool use. The transition from aquatic to terrestrial existence marked a crucial evolutionary milestone as the proto-Laer developed their characteristic dual-nature physiology that would define their species for millennia to come. The mature Laer possessed a striking anatomical structure that immediately distinguished them from most sentient species encountered throughout the galaxy. Their lower bodies consisted of powerful serpentine coils, typically measuring between 4 and 6 meters in length when fully extended. These muscular appendages provided exceptional mobility across varied terrain, allowing individual Laer to navigate vertical surfaces, swim through liquid environments, and achieve remarkable speeds across open ground. The serpentine section featured overlapping scales that ranged in coloration from deep emerald to brilliant azure, with intricate patterns that served both protective and social functions within their complex hierarchy. Above this serpentine foundation rose humanoid torsos that demonstrated clear signs of evolutionary adaptation for tool manipulation and complex motor functions. Laer possessed 4 arms arranged in bilateral symmetry, each terminating in hands featuring 6 elongated digits capable of extraordinary dexterity. Their cranial structure housed enlarged brain cavities that accommodated their highly developed neural architecture, while their facial features combined reptilian and quasi-mammalian characteristics. Large, multifaceted eyes provided exceptional visual acuity across multiple spectrums, while their elongated skulls housed sophisticated sensory organs capable of detecting chemical traces, electromagnetic fluctuations, and even psychic emanations. The Laer respiratory system operated through a combination of lung-based breathing and specialized gill slits located along their neck region, allowing them to function effectively in both atmospheric and aquatic environments. Their circulatory system featured multiple hearts distributed throughout their elongated bodies, ensuring efficient blood flow even during extreme physical exertion. Perhaps most remarkably, the Laer possessed a decentralized nervous system that extended throughout their serpentine length, providing redundant neural pathways that made them exceptionally difficult to incapacitate through conventional means. Laer society developed around a sophisticated caste system that determined individual roles, privileges, and responsibilities from birth. The ruling hegemony consisted of the most genetically pure bloodlines, identifiable by their larger cranial capacity, more vibrant scale coloration, and additional sensory organs. These elite individuals typically measured longer than their subordinates and possessed enhanced psychic sensitivity that allowed them to interface directly with their biotechnological creations. The hegemony maintained absolute authority over all aspects of Laer civilization, from resource allocation to reproductive permissions. Beneath the hegemony existed the synthesis caste, comprising the scientific and technological specialists responsible for advancing Laer biotechnology and maintaining their organic infrastructure. Members of this caste underwent extensive genetic modification from early development, enhancing their analytical capabilities and fine motor control at the expense of physical prowess. Their scales often bore distinctive geometric patterns that indicated their specific areas of expertise, while surgical implants allowed direct neural interface with their living machines and weapons systems. The cultivation caste formed the backbone of Laer agricultural and manufacturing sectors, their bodies adapted for sustained physical labor and environmental manipulation. These individuals possessed enhanced strength and endurance, along with specialized glands that secreted various enzymes and compounds necessary for their biotechnological processes. Their role extended beyond mere production to include the careful tending of the living cities and the maintenance of the complex ecosystems that supported Laer civilization. Military functions fell to the predation caste, whose members underwent the most extensive physical modifications of any group within Laer society. Their serpentine sections developed enhanced musculature and reinforced scaling, while their humanoid portions featured enlarged sensory organs and additional limbs specifically adapted for combat operations. Many predation caste members received implanted weapon systems that grew directly from their bodies, creating living arsenals capable of adapting their armaments to specific tactical requirements. At the foundation of Laer society existed the substrate caste, individuals whose genetic heritage or developmental anomalies relegated them to menial tasks and basic labor. Despite their lower status, the substrate played crucial roles in maintaining the vast organic networks that sustained Laer civilization, their intimate knowledge of biological systems proving indispensable to the Empire's continued function. The technological achievements of the Laer centered around their unparalleled mastery of biotechnology and genetic manipulation. Rather than relying on mechanical devices and artificial intelligence like many advanced civilizations, the Laer developed sophisticated techniques for creating living tools, weapons, and even architectural structures. Their cities grew from carefully cultivated seed organisms, expanding and adapting over generations to meet the changing needs of their inhabitants. These urban environments featured neural networks that monitored environmental conditions, adjusted atmospheric composition, and even provided rudimentary communication services between distant districts. Laer weapons represented the pinnacle of their biotechnological prowess, combining lethal efficiency with organic adaptability. Their small arms consisted of living creatures bred specifically for combat applications, capable of firing various projectiles ranging from hardened bone spikes to corrosive biological agents. These weapons formed symbiotic relationships with their wielders, adapting their performance characteristics based on the user's physiological responses and tactical requirements. Larger weapon systems incorporated multiple organisms working in concert, creating devastating artillery pieces capable of launching explosive spores or directed energy attacks generated through biological processes. Their spacecraft demonstrated similar principles, grown rather than constructed in traditional manufacturing facilities. These vessels possessed self-healing capabilities that allowed them to recover from battle damage, while their organic hulls could adapt to different environmental conditions encountered during interstellar travel. The ship's navigation systems relied on specially bred organisms sensitive to gravitational fields and stellar radiation, providing remarkably accurate positioning data across vast distances. The Laer achieved interstellar travel through a combination of conventional propulsion systems and their unique biotechnology. Their vessels incorporated living components that could process raw materials encountered during voyages, converting asteroid debris and stellar gases into fuel and construction materials. This capability allowed Laer expeditions to operate independently for extended periods, establishing new colonies and expanding their territorial holdings without requiring supply lines back to their core worlds. Their colonization efforts followed carefully planned patterns that prioritized worlds with suitable atmospheric conditions and abundant biological resources. Upon arrival at potential colony sites, advanced teams would deploy specialized organisms designed to begin terraforming processes, gradually altering local ecosystems to support Laer physiology. These transformation projects often required decades or even centuries to complete, but resulted in worlds perfectly adapted to Laer requirements. The Laer developed sophisticated communication networks that span their entire empire, utilizing organisms capable of transmitting information across interstellar distances through methods that Imperial xenobiologists still struggle to understand. These biological communication systems provided near instantaneous coordination between distant worlds, allowing the Laer to maintain centralized control over their expanding territory despite the vast distances involved. Their understanding of genetics surpassed that of most contemporary civilizations, enabling them to create new life forms tailored to specific purposes. Laer biotechnicians could design organisms capable of surviving in extreme environments, processing toxic materials, or performing complex manufacturing tasks. This capability extended to their own species, as the Laer routinely modified themselves to enhance their natural abilities or adapt to new environmental challenges. The agricultural systems supporting Laer civilization represented another triumph of their biotechnological expertise. Rather than traditional farming methods, they cultivated vast networks of interconnected organisms that converted raw materials into nutritionally complete food sources. These biological factories operated with remarkable efficiency, producing surplus resources that supported their expanding population and ambitious colonization projects. The Laer's mastery of biotechnology inevitably led them down a path that would fundamentally alter their civilization's trajectory. What began as practical applications of genetic manipulation gradually evolved into an obsession with perfection that consumed every aspect of their society. The initial modifications served clear utilitarian purposes, enhancing physical capabilities, extending lifespans, and adapting to diverse planetary environments. However, as generations passed, the line between necessity and desire became increasingly blurred, ultimately setting the stage for their civilization's most profound transformation. The pursuit of physical perfection manifested first within the hegemony caste, whose members possessed both the authority and resources to commission the most advanced biological enhancements available. Early modifications focused on expanding their already impressive sensory capabilities, with biotechnicians developing specialized organs capable of perceiving electromagnetic spectrums invisible to unmodified Laer. These enhanced individuals could observe the intricate energy patterns flowing through their living cities, detect the subtle chemical signatures of different emotional states in their subjects, and even perceive the faint psychic emanations generated by various life forms. The success of these initial enhancements sparked demand for increasingly sophisticated modifications throughout Laer society. Members of the synthesis caste began incorporating additional neural clusters into their cranial structures, expanding their cognitive processing power beyond natural limitations. These augmented individuals could simultaneously analyze multiple complex biotechnological projects while maintaining perfect awareness of their surroundings. Their modified brains featured specialized lobes dedicated to pattern recognition, allowing them to identify genetic sequences and biological processes with unprecedented accuracy. Physical modifications soon followed cognitive enhancements, as the Laer discovered methods for reshaping their bodies according to aesthetic preferences rather than functional requirements. The serpentine sections of their anatomy became canvases for elaborate modifications, with individuals commissioning changes to their scale patterns, coloration, and even basic structural configuration. Some members of the upper castes extended their serpentine lengths beyond natural parameters, creating impossibly graceful forms that undulated through their organic cities with hypnotic beauty. The cultivation caste embraced modifications that enhanced their connection to the biological systems they tended, developing symbiotic relationships with the organisms under their care. These individuals incorporated living sensors into their nervous systems, allowing them to monitor the health and emotional states of entire ecosystems through direct neural feedback. Their hands evolved specialized appendages capable of secreting various nutrients and growth hormones, enabling them to nurture their charges with unprecedented precision and efficiency. Within the predation caste, the pursuit of perfection took more aggressive forms as warriors sought modifications that would elevate their combat effectiveness to artistic levels. Their bodies became living weapon systems, incorporating retractable blade appendages that emerged from concealed sheaths within their arms. These organic weapons featured edges sharper than any conventional metal, while their surfaces displayed intricate patterns that served both decorative and functional purposes. The warrior's scales developed the ability to shift color and texture, providing natural camouflage capabilities that allowed them to blend seamlessly with their surroundings. As these modifications became more widespread and sophisticated, the Laer began experiencing sensations that transcended their natural evolutionary parameters. Enhanced nervous systems capable of processing vastly expanded sensory input created opportunities for experiences that previous generations could never have imagined. The simple act of consuming food became an elaborate ritual involving dozens of different taste receptors, each calibrated to detect specific molecular compounds and convert them into waves of pleasure that cascaded through their modified neural networks. The pursuit of sensory enhancement led to the development of specialized chambers within Laer cities dedicated entirely to the exploration of sensation. These organic structures grew from the same biotechnology that created their weapons and tools, but served purely aesthetic and experiential purposes. The chamber's walls secreted various compounds designed to stimulate different sensory organs simultaneously, creating immersive environments where modified Laer could experience combinations of sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch that pushed the boundaries of their enhanced physiologies. These sensory chambers became gathering places for the elite members of Laer society, who competed to commission ever more elaborate and intense experiences. The biotechnicians responsible for designing these environments pushed their creative boundaries, developing organisms capable of generating complex light patterns synchronized with musical compositions produced by living instruments. The chambers themselves began to respond to the emotional states of their occupants, adjusting their outputs to amplify and enhance whatever sensations the visitors were experiencing. The cultural shift toward sensation-seeking gradually permeated every level of Laer society, though it manifested differently within each caste. The hegemony transformed their governing councils into elaborate performances where political decisions were made through ritualized displays of enhanced beauty and sensory prowess. Traditional debates gave way to competitions involving the demonstration of increasingly exotic modifications and the ability to experience and articulate sensations beyond the comprehension of unmodified individuals. Members of the synthesis caste began incorporating aesthetic considerations into their biotechnological creations, designing organisms whose primary purpose was to generate beautiful or pleasurable experiences rather than serve practical functions. Their living cities evolved beyond mere habitation structures to become vast sensory networks designed to stimulate and delight their inhabitants. Streets pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that responded to the footsteps of passers-by, while the air itself carried carefully calibrated chemical compounds designed to induce states of euphoria and heightened awareness. The cultivation caste's relationship with their biological charges took on increasingly intimate dimensions as they developed deeper symbiotic connections with the organisms under their care. These individuals began experiencing the life cycles of their charges as personal journeys, feeling the growth and development of plants and animals as extensions of their own existence. Their modifications allowed them to share in the simple pleasures of photosynthesis, the satisfaction of successful reproduction, and the complex emotional states of higher-order organisms within their care. Even the substrate caste found ways to participate in the growing obsession with sensation, though their limited resources restricted them to more basic modifications. These individuals formed communities dedicated to exploring the enhanced experiences available through group activities and shared sensory modifications. Their gatherings became elaborate celebrations where participants would synchronize their modified nervous systems to experience collective sensations that transcended individual limitations. The technological infrastructure supporting these pursuits required increasingly sophisticated biotechnological systems capable of producing the complex compounds and organisms necessary for advanced sensory enhancement. Laer biotechnicians developed specialized breeding programs focused on creating creatures whose sole purpose was to generate specific sensory experiences. These organisms ranged from microscopic entities that could be introduced directly into the Laer nervous system to massive installations that served entire districts within their living cities. The breeding facilities themselves became temples to the pursuit of perfect sensation, their organic architecture designed to optimize every aspect of the creation process. The structures incorporated neural networks that monitored the development of their charges with obsessive precision, adjusting environmental conditions to encourage the expression of desired traits. The biotechnicians working within these facilities underwent extensive modifications that allowed them to interface directly with their creations, experiencing the development process as a form of artistic expression. As the Laer's pursuit of sensory perfection intensified, their society began exhibiting behaviors that would have been incomprehensible to their ancestors. Traditional concepts of restraint and moderation gave way to an endless quest for new and more intense experiences. The boundaries between different castes became increasingly fluid as individuals sought modifications that would allow them to access sensory experiences previously restricted to other social groups. The transformation accelerated as the Laer discovered methods for creating artificial experiences that surpassed anything available through natural means. Their biotechnicians developed organisms capable of directly stimulating neural pathways, bypassing normal sensory organs to create sensations that existed purely within the modified brain. These experiences proved so compelling that many individuals began spending increasing amounts of time connected to these biological systems, neglecting their traditional responsibilities in favor of exploring ever more elaborate artificial sensations. The living cities themselves began reflecting their inhabitants' changing priorities, with new growth patterns emerging that prioritized aesthetic and sensory considerations over practical functionality. Districts dedicated entirely to the pursuit of pleasure appeared throughout Laer settlements, their organic architecture designed to maximize the sensory impact of every surface, texture, and environmental feature. These areas became focal points for Laer society, drawing individuals from across their empire to experience the latest developments in sensory enhancement technology. The pursuit of physical perfection evolved beyond mere enhancement to encompass complete reconstruction of the Laer form according to idealized aesthetic principles. Individuals began commissioning modifications that bore little resemblance to their species' natural anatomy, creating bodies that existed as living artworks designed to generate and experience sensations impossible for unmodified organisms. These extreme modifications required constant maintenance and adjustment, leading to the development of an entire industry dedicated to supporting individuals whose bodies had transcended biological limitations. The Laer's transformation from a civilization focused on practical biotechnology to one obsessed with sensory perfection reached its apex through their revolutionary fusion of organic matter with mechanical components. This breakthrough emerged from the synthesis cast's relentless experimentation with hybrid technologies, initially developed to address the limitations inherent in purely biological systems. While their living weapons and organic architecture possessed remarkable adaptability, they lacked the precision and durability that certain applications demanded. The solution lay not in abandoning their biotechnological mastery, but in creating seamless integrations between flesh and metal that preserved the advantages of both approaches. The first successful biomechanical hybrids appeared in the Laer's manufacturing facilities, where synthesis cast biotechnicians discovered methods for incorporating metallic components directly into living tissue without triggering rejection responses. These early experiments involved implanting microscopic metal filaments into the nervous systems of specialized organisms, creating creatures capable of conducting electrical signals with perfect efficiency while maintaining their biological flexibility. The breakthrough came when researchers realized that certain rare metals found in Laeren's deep crust could be processed by modified organisms, allowing living creatures to literally grow metallic components as natural extensions of their anatomy. The process required extensive preparation of both the organic hosts and the metallic materials involved. Laer biotechnicians developed specialized enzymes capable of breaking down complex metal ores into their constituent elements, which could then be absorbed and incorporated into cellular structures through carefully controlled metabolic processes. The organisms selected for these procedures underwent months of conditioning. Their bodies gradually adapted to accept foreign materials through systematic exposure to increasing concentrations of processed metals. The integration occurred at the cellular level, with individual cells developing the ability to extrude metallic fibers that grew alongside natural tissue structures. These biomechanical organisms demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything achieved through purely biological or mechanical means. Living weapons incorporating metallic components could generate projectiles with consistent ballistic properties while retaining the adaptive characteristics that made Laer biotechnology superior to conventional armaments. The metal components provided structural integrity and precision guidance systems, while the organic elements allowed for real-time adjustment of performance parameters based on environmental conditions and tactical requirements. The architectural applications of biomechanical integration transformed Laer cities into marvels that defied conventional understanding of construction principles. Organic structures incorporated metallic frameworks that provided enhanced stability without sacrificing the adaptive growth patterns that characterized Laer building techniques. These hybrid buildings could expand and modify their configurations in response to changing needs while maintaining structural integrity that surpassed purely organic constructions. The metallic components served as neural pathways that carried information throughout the structures, creating building-wide nervous systems capable of coordinating complex environmental adjustments. The development of living weapons that formed symbiotic bonds with their wielders represented the pinnacle of Laer biomechanical technology. These weapons began as carefully bred organisms designed to interface directly with Laer physiology, their nervous systems engineered to complement and enhance their users' natural capabilities. The creatures featured specialized attachment points that connected directly to nerve clusters in the Laer's multiple arms, creating neural pathways that allowed for instantaneous communication between wielder and weapon. The metallic components integrated into these organisms provided the precision and durability necessary for effective combat applications, while preserving the adaptive characteristics that made them superior to conventional armaments. The bonding process between Laer warriors and their living weapons required extensive preparation and conditioning for both parties involved. Potential wielders underwent surgical procedures that implanted interface nodes at specific points along their nervous systems, creating connection points that could accommodate the weapon's neural tendrils. The weapons themselves were cultivated from embryonic stages in specialized chambers that exposed them to their intended wielder's biochemical signature, ensuring perfect compatibility when the bonding finally occurred. The initial connection established basic communication pathways, but the true symbiotic relationship developed over months of shared experience as weapon and wielder learned to coordinate their responses to various combat situations. These symbiotic weapons demonstrated remarkable versatility in their operational capabilities. The basic organisms could reconfigure their firing mechanisms to accommodate different types of ammunition, switching between projectile types based on tactical requirements communicated directly from their wielder's nervous system. The metallic components provided targeting systems that interfaced with the Laer's enhanced sensory organs, creating aiming solutions that accounted for environmental factors, target movement patterns, and ballistic trajectories with supernatural accuracy. The organic elements allowed the weapons to adapt their performance characteristics in real time, adjusting firing rates, projectile velocity, and even ammunition types based on the specific threats encountered during combat operations. The larger weapon systems developed by the Laer incorporated multiple organisms, working in concert with extensive metallic support structures to create artillery pieces that blurred the line between living creatures and mechanical devices. These installations featured primary organisms responsible for generating and launching projectiles, supported by secondary creatures that handled targeting, ammunition production, and environmental monitoring. The metallic framework provided structural support and served as a communication network that coordinated the activities of all organic components. The resulting weapons could engage targets at extreme ranges while adapting their firing solutions based on real-time battlefield intelligence gathered through their integrated sensory networks. Laer combat doctrines evolved to take full advantage of their biomechanical hybrid warfare capabilities. Traditional tactical formations gave way to fluid arrangements that emphasized the adaptive nature of their living weapons and the enhanced coordination possible through direct neural interfaces. Individual warriors could share sensory information and tactical assessments through their weapon systems, creating unit-wide awareness that allowed for unprecedented coordination during combat operations. The symbiotic bonds between warriors and weapons enabled split-second tactical adjustments that would have been impossible with conventional armaments. The integration of biomechanical technology into Laer military doctrine required extensive modifications to their existing command structures and training protocols. Officers underwent additional surgical procedures that allowed them to interface directly with multiple weapon systems simultaneously, creating command nodes capable of coordinating complex tactical maneuvers across entire battlefield sectors. These enhanced commanders could process information from dozens of different sources while maintaining direct control over their personal weapons, creating a level of battlefield awareness that surpassed anything achieved by conventional military organizations. The architectural marvels created through biomechanical integration demonstrated the Laer's ability to combine organic growth patterns with technological sophistication on a massive scale. Their cities featured buildings that grew from seed organisms over periods of decades, their organic components guided by metallic frameworks that ensured proper structural development. These frameworks incorporated sophisticated environmental monitoring systems that tracked atmospheric conditions, seismic activity, and even the emotional states of the building's inhabitants. The organic components responded to this information by adjusting their growth patterns, internal configurations, and even their biochemical outputs to optimize living conditions for their Laer occupants. The transportation networks within Laer cities exemplified their mastery of biomechanical integration. Rather than conventional vehicles, the Laer developed living transport organisms that incorporated metallic guidance systems and structural reinforcements. These creatures could navigate the organic tunnel networks that connected different districts while adapting their size and configuration to accommodate varying passenger loads and cargo requirements. The metallic components provided navigation systems that interfaced with city-wide information networks, ensuring optimal routing and scheduling for all transportation activities. The manufacturing capabilities enabled by biomechanical integration allowed the Laer to produce complex devices that combine the best characteristics of biological and mechanical systems. Their production facilities featured organisms capable of processing raw materials and extruding finished products according to specifications transmitted through neural interfaces. The metallic components provided precision control systems that ensured consistent quality and dimensional accuracy, while the organic elements allowed for real-time adjustments based on material properties and environmental conditions. These hybrid manufacturing systems could produce everything from personal weapons to spacecraft components with equal facility. The spacecraft, developed through biomechanical integration, represented the ultimate expression of Laer technological achievement. These vessels combined organic hulls capable of self-repair and environmental adaptation with metallic frameworks that provided structural integrity and housed sophisticated navigation and communication systems. The ship's propulsion systems utilized organisms bred specifically for space travel, their metabolic processes enhanced by metallic components that improved efficiency and provided precise thrust control. The crew interfaces incorporated direct neural connections that allowed Laer operators to control ship functions through thought alone, creating a level of responsiveness that conventional spacecraft could never achieve. The defensive systems protecting Laer worlds incorporated biomechanical installations that could adapt their responses to different types of threats while maintaining the firepower necessary to engage hostile forces across interstellar distances. These planetary defense networks featured organisms capable of detecting approaching threats through biological sensors enhanced by metallic components that provided precise targeting data. The weapons themselves combined organic projectile generation systems with metallic guidance and propulsion components, creating defensive capabilities that could engage multiple targets simultaneously while adapting their ammunition types based on threat characteristics. The maintenance requirements for biomechanical systems created entirely new specializations within Laer society. Technicians responsible for these hybrid technologies needed expertise in both biological sciences and mechanical engineering, their training encompassing everything from genetic manipulation to metallurgy. These specialists underwent extensive modifications that enhanced their ability to interface with both organic and mechanical components. Their nervous systems adapted to process the complex feedback generated by biomechanical systems during operation and maintenance procedures. The resource requirements for biomechanical integration drove the Laer to expand their mining and processing operations across multiple star systems. The rare metals necessary for successful integration could only be found in specific geological formations, requiring extensive exploration and extraction efforts to maintain adequate supplies. The Laer developed specialized organisms capable of locating and processing these materials, their sensory systems enhanced by metallic components that could detect trace concentrations of valuable elements across vast distances. The expansion of the Great Crusade into the purged sector during the early decades of the 31st millennium brought Imperial forces into contact with numerous xenos civilizations that had flourished during humanity's isolation. Among these encounters, none would prove more significant or devastating than the discovery of the Laeran system approximately 2 centuries after the Crusade's inception. The Third Legion, known as the Emperor's Children, under the command of their Primarch Fulgrim, had been tasked with bringing compliance to several sectors beyond the established Imperial frontier when their scout vessels detected the distinctive energy signatures emanating from the Laeran homeworld. The initial reconnaissance reports transmitted back to the Crusade fleet painted a picture of a technologically sophisticated civilization that had achieved remarkable mastery over biological manipulation and hybrid technologies. Imperial astropaths reported difficulty in maintaining clear communication channels near the Laeran system, their psychic transmissions somehow distorted by what appeared to be organic interference patterns unlike anything previously encountered. The scout ship's auger arrays detected massive artificial structures on the planet's surface, but these constructions defied conventional architectural principles, appearing to pulse and shift in ways that suggested living rather than static construction. The Emperor's Children approached the Laeran system with the methodical precision that had characterized their operations throughout the Great Crusade. Fulgrim ordered extensive reconnaissance sweeps of the outer planets, seeking to understand the full extent of Laer territorial holdings before committing to direct engagement. These preliminary surveys revealed a civilization that had transformed multiple worlds within the system, each adapted to serve specific functions within their empire. Mining worlds featured vast organic processing facilities that consumed raw materials and converted them into the exotic compounds necessary for Laer biotechnology, while agricultural planets hosted ecosystems so extensively modified that they bore little resemblance to their original biospheres. The strategic assessment prepared by the Legion's command staff identified the Laeran system as occupying a crucial position along several major warp routes that connected the purged sector to the expanding Imperial frontier. Control of these passages would provide the Imperium with significantly improved logistics capabilities for future expansion efforts, while denying them to the xenos would eliminate potential threats to established Imperial worlds in adjacent sectors. The system's location made it an inevitable target for compliance operations, regardless of the specific characteristics of its inhabitants. Initial attempts at establishing communication with the Laer leadership followed standard Imperial protocols for first contact with technologically advanced xeno civilizations. The Emperor's children transmitted messages in multiple languages, offering the inhabitants of Laeran the opportunity to submit to Imperial authority and accept integration into the expanding human empire. These communications went unanswered for several days, leading Legion tacticians to assume that the Xenos either lacked the technological capability to respond or were preparing defensive measures against the Imperial fleet. The first direct contact occurred when a small flotilla of Laer vessels emerged from the outer reaches of their system, approaching the Imperial fleet with movements that defied conventional understanding of spacecraft maneuvering. The Xenos ships moved with an organic fluidity that suggested living rather than mechanical propulsion systems, their hulls shifting and adapting as they navigated through space. Imperial auger operators reported difficulty in maintaining targeting locks on the approaching vessels, as their energy signatures fluctuated in patterns that seemed to anticipate and counter Imperial scanning attempts. The Laer delegation that eventually boarded the Emperor's flagship presented themselves as representatives of their civilization's ruling hegemony, though their appearance immediately challenged Imperial expectations of Xeno's leadership. The creatures that emerged from their organic transport possessed a serpentine grace that combined reptilian characteristics with an unsettling beauty that seemed to shift and change as observers watched. Their four-armed humanoid torsos rose from coiled lower bodies that moved with hypnotic fluidity, while their scaled skin displayed patterns that appeared to respond to their emotional states and the reactions of those around them. The Laer representatives demonstrated remarkable linguistic capabilities, quickly mastering Gothic through what appeared to be direct neural interface with their biotechnological translation systems. Their communications revealed a civilization that viewed itself as having achieved a level of perfection that transcended the crude mechanical technologies employed by most galactic powers. They expressed curiosity about Imperial achievements in genetic manipulation and biotechnology, while displaying dismissive attitudes toward the Imperium's reliance on what they characterized as primitive mechanical devices and artificial intelligence systems. Fulgrim's personal involvement in the initial negotiations reflected both his diplomatic inclinations and his growing fascination with the Laer's claims of having achieved perfection through biological enhancement. The Primarch had always possessed an appreciation for beauty and excellence in all its forms, and the Laer representatives seemed to embody an aesthetic sophistication that resonated with his own philosophical inclinations. Their descriptions of their civilization's achievements in sensory enhancement and physical modification aligned with concepts that had long intrigued the leader of the Emperor's children. The detailed intelligence gathered during these preliminary exchanges revealed a xeno civilization that had developed along radically different lines from most species encountered during the Great Crusade. Rather than pursuing technological advancement through mechanical engineering and artificial intelligence, the Laer had focused their efforts on manipulating biological systems to achieve capabilities that exceeded conventional technological solutions. Their weapons, vehicles, and even architectural structures represented living organisms bred and modified for specific purposes, creating a technological base that could adapt and evolve in ways that mechanical systems could not match. Imperial xenobiologists studying the intelligence reports identified numerous aspects of Laer biotechnology that could potentially benefit the Imperium if properly understood and adapted for human use. The creature's ability to create self-repairing spacecraft, adaptive weapon systems, and responsive architectural structures represented significant advances over existing Imperial technologies. However, the reports also noted disturbing elements within Laer society, particularly their obsession with sensory enhancement and physical modification that appeared to have consumed their entire civilization's focus and resources. The Legion's apothecaries expressed particular interest in the Laer's genetic manipulation techniques, which appeared to exceed even the advanced biological sciences employed in the creation of the Astartes. The xenos had developed methods for seamlessly integrating foreign genetic material into existing organisms while maintaining stability and functionality across multiple generations. Their ability to create hybrid organisms that combine the best characteristics of multiple species suggested applications that could enhance Imperial military capabilities if properly researched and implemented. The strategic implications of the Laer's biotechnological mastery became increasingly apparent as intelligence reports detailed their military capabilities. Their living weapons could adapt their performance characteristics in real time based on battlefield conditions, while their organic spacecraft possessed self-repair capabilities that allowed them to recover from battle damage without requiring extensive maintenance facilities. The integration of metallic components into their biological systems created hybrid technologies that combine the adaptability of living organisms with the precision and durability of mechanical devices. The Emperor's children found themselves facing a tactical challenge unlike any previously encountered during the Great Crusade. The Laer's organic cities could potentially reconfigure their defensive layouts in response to Imperial assault patterns, while their living weapons might adapt their ammunition types and firing characteristics to counter specific Imperial equipment and tactics. Traditional siege warfare doctrines developed for use against conventional fortifications and mechanical weapon systems would require significant modification to address the adaptive nature of Laer defensive capabilities. Intelligence assessments of Laer military doctrine revealed a sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics that utilized the adaptive characteristics of their biotechnology to maximum advantage. Their warriors formed symbiotic bonds with their weapons that created unprecedented levels of coordination and responsiveness during combat operations. Individual soldiers could share sensory information and tactical assessments through their weapon systems, enabling unit-wide situational awareness that surpassed anything achieved by conventional military forces. The Laer's defensive preparations for the inevitable Imperial assault demonstrated their ability to rapidly adapt their military posture to address specific threats. Reconnaissance flights detected new organic structures appearing throughout their cities, their purposes unclear but their rapid growth suggesting some form of accelerated defensive construction program. The planet's orbital defenses incorporated living components that made them difficult to target effectively, as their energy signatures fluctuated in patterns that interfered with Imperial targeting systems. The cultural assessment prepared by the Legion's intelligence officers identified aspects of Laer society that aligned disturbingly well with certain philosophical tendencies within the Emperor's children themselves. The Xeno civilization's pursuit of perfection through enhancement and modification resonated with the Legion's own emphasis on excellence and self-improvement. Their sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities and appreciation for beauty in all its forms created unexpected common ground between the two civilizations, despite the fundamental incompatibility of their respective goals and methods. Fulgrim's growing fascination with the Laer extended beyond mere tactical interest to encompass genuine admiration for their achievements in pursuing perfection through biological enhancement. The Primarch had always sought to push the boundaries of what was possible, whether in combat, artistry, or personal development. The Laer's success in transcending their natural limitations through controlled evolution represented an approach to self-improvement that appealed to his philosophical inclinations and personal ambitions. The preliminary negotiations revealed that the Laer possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial expansion patterns and military capabilities, suggesting an intelligence network that extended far beyond their home system. Their representatives demonstrated familiarity with Astartes' combat doctrines and equipment specifications that could only have been obtained through extensive observation of Imperial military operations. This intelligence capability represented a significant threat to future Imperial operations in the region, as the xenos could potentially share their knowledge with other hostile civilizations. The Laer's diplomatic approach combined apparent reasonableness with subtle attempts to influence their Imperial counterparts through demonstration of their enhanced capabilities. Their representatives would casually display sensory abilities that exceeded human norms, while their biotechnological devices performed functions that seemed to border on the miraculous. These demonstrations appeared designed to generate curiosity and admiration among their Imperial audiences, potentially undermining the xenophobic attitudes that typically characterized Imperial first contact protocols. The extended negotiations provided the Emperor's children with unprecedented insight into a xeno-civilization that had achieved remarkable technological sophistication through radically different developmental paths. The Laer's mastery of biotechnology represented capabilities that could potentially revolutionize Imperial military and civilian applications if properly understood and adapted. However, their obsession with sensory enhancement and physical modification raised concerns about the psychological and cultural implications of adopting their techniques. The intelligence gathered during these preliminary exchanges would prove crucial in developing tactical approaches for the inevitable military confrontation. The Laer's adaptive technologies and symbiotic weapon systems required countermeasures that went beyond conventional Imperial military doctrine. The Legion's tactical staff began developing specialized assault protocols designed to address the unique challenges posed by an enemy whose weapons and defenses could potentially evolve during combat operations. The diplomatic overtures between the Emperor's children and the Laer hegemony collapsed when the Xenos delegation presented their final terms for coexistence with the expanding Imperium. Rather than accepting Imperial sovereignty over their territories, the Laer proposed a mutual exchange of technologies and biological enhancement techniques that would benefit both civilizations. Their representatives suggested that the Astartes could achieve even greater perfection through the application of Laer biotechnology, while Imperial mechanical expertise could enhance their own hybrid systems. This proposal fundamentally violated the core tenets of Imperial doctrine regarding Xenos contact, making military action inevitable despite Fulgrim's personal fascination with their achievements. The Emperor's children initiated their assault on the Laeran system with a methodical bombardment of the outer planetary installations that served as early warning stations and resource processing facilities. These initial strikes revealed the adaptive nature of Laer defensive systems, as the organic structures under attack began reconfiguring themselves to present smaller target profiles, while simultaneously launching clouds of defensive spores that interfered with Imperial targeting systems. The bombardment cannons of the Legion's battle barges found their usual precision compromised by the shifting nature of their targets, requiring extended engagement periods to achieve destruction of installations that conventional fortifications would have eliminated with single salvos. The Laer response to the Imperial assault demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of void warfare tactics adapted to their unique technological capabilities. Rather than deploying conventional fleet formations, they launched swarms of smaller biomechanical craft that moved through space with organic fluidity, their trajectories constantly shifting to avoid Imperial weapons fire. These vessels proved remarkably difficult to track and engage, as their hulls incorporated adaptive camouflage systems that could mimic the electromagnetic signatures of space debris or even Imperial craft when viewed at distance. The creatures piloting these ships maintained direct neural connections to their vessel's sensory systems, allowing for reaction times that exceeded anything possible with conventional pilot interfaces. Imperial fighter squadrons found themselves confronting an enemy that violated every principle of conventional aerospace combat doctrine. The Laer craft could alter their configuration during flight, extending or retracting wing-like appendages to optimize their performance for specific maneuvers. Their weapon systems fired projectiles that appeared to track their targets through some form of biological guidance system, adjusting their flight paths to compensate for evasive maneuvers with accuracy that suggested near sentient ammunition. The organic nature of these projectiles made them resistant to conventional point defense systems, as they could absorb significant damage while remaining functional enough to reach their intended targets. The initial void engagements cost the Emperor's children several squadrons of fighters and considerable damage to their escort vessels before Imperial tacticians developed effective countermeasures against Laer biotechnology. The breakthrough came when Legion Techmarines discovered that the organic components of Laer systems were vulnerable to specific electromagnetic frequencies that disrupted their neural networks. By modifying their weapons to emit these disruptive signals, Imperial forces could temporarily incapacitate Laer craft long enough to destroy them with conventional firepower. The assault on Laeran itself required extensive preparation, as Imperial forces analyzed the defensive capabilities of the planet's organic cities. Reconnaissance data revealed urban centers that defied conventional understanding of fortification design, their structures growing from the planet's surface in patterns that suggested both aesthetic and defensive considerations. The cities incorporated multiple layers of organic barriers that could rapidly seal breaches or reconfigure to channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. The living architecture featured sensory networks that detected approaching threats and coordinated defensive responses across entire metropolitan areas. The Laer had transformed their homeworld's surface into a complex ecosystem designed to support their biotechnological civilization while providing comprehensive defensive coverage against potential invaders. Vast networks of underground route systems connected distant cities, allowing for rapid communication and resource sharing across continental distances. These biological communication channels proved resistant to Imperial jamming attempts, as they operated through biochemical signals rather than electromagnetic transmissions. The planet's atmosphere itself had been modified to carry trace amounts of compounds that enhanced Laer sensory capabilities, while potentially interfering with unmodified human respiratory systems. Fulgrim's tactical assessment of the planetary assault identified several primary hive cities that served as command and control centers for the Laer defensive network. The destruction of these urban complexes would cripple their ability to coordinate resistance across the planet, while eliminating the industrial facilities necessary to maintain their biotechnological military systems. However, the organic nature of these cities meant that conventional siege tactics would prove ineffective, as the structures could potentially adapt their defensive configurations faster than Imperial forces could adjust their assault strategies. The first major engagement occurred during the assault on the coastal metroplex designated Laeran Prime by Imperial cartographers. The city's defensive systems activated as soon as Imperial drop pods entered the planet's atmosphere, launching clouds of airborne organisms that attempted to intercept the descending Astartes before they could reach the surface. These aerial defenders resembled massive flying serpents with membranous wings that could fold and extend to optimize their flight characteristics for different atmospheric conditions. Their attacks focused on disrupting drop pod navigation systems through the emission of electromagnetic pulses generated by specialized organs, while their razor-sharp talons sought to breach the armored shells, protecting the space marines within. The Emperor's children who successfully reached the surface found themselves fighting through urban terrain that actively opposed their advance. The streets themselves seemed alive, their surfaces shifting to create obstacles or pitfalls that could trap unwary warriors. Buildings reconfigured their internal layouts to confuse invaders, while organic barriers emerged from seemingly solid walls to block corridors or redirect movement patterns. The city's defensive systems demonstrated remarkable coordination, with different districts supporting each other through the rapid deployment of reinforcements through concealed tunnel networks that connected the various urban sectors. Laer defenders emerged from concealed positions throughout the city, their symbiotic weapons adapting their firing patterns to counter specific Imperial equipment and tactics. The warriors themselves had undergone extensive modifications that enhanced their combat effectiveness beyond their species' natural capabilities. Their serpentine lower bodies provided exceptional mobility across the vertical surfaces of their organic architecture, while additional limbs grafted to their torsos allowed them to wield multiple weapons simultaneously. The scales covering their bodies had been enhanced with metallic components that provided natural armor protection while maintaining the flexibility necessary for their fluid movement patterns. The weapons employed by Laer defenders demonstrated the sophisticated integration of biological and mechanical components that characterized their military technology. Individual soldiers carried organisms that served as both ranged weapons and close combat implements, their forms shifting between configurations as tactical requirements changed. These living weapons fired projectiles that ranged from hardened bone spikes to corrosive biological agents, with ammunition types selected based on target characteristics communicated through neural interfaces. The creature's ability to adapt their performance in real time made them remarkably effective against Astartes' power armor, as they could adjust their projectile characteristics to exploit specific vulnerabilities in Imperial equipment. The assault on the central spire complex that served as Laer Prime's command center required the Emperor's children to fight through multiple layers of organic defenses that became increasingly sophisticated as they approached their objective. The outer perimeter featured relatively simple barrier organisms that relied primarily on physical obstruction and toxic secretions to impede attackers. However, the inner defensive rings incorporated creatures with advanced sensory capabilities that could detect Imperial forces through multiple spectrums while coordinating attacks through the city's neural network. Captain Julius Kisoron led the assault on the Spire's primary access points, his company encountering Laer defenders whose modifications exceeded anything previously observed during the campaign. These elite warriors had integrated additional weapon systems directly into their bodies, creating living arsenals that could engage multiple targets simultaneously while adapting their tactics based on real-time battlefield analysis. Their serpentine sections featured retractable blade appendages that emerged from concealed sheaths, while their humanoid torsos mounted ranged weapons that grew directly from modified limb structures. The fighting within the spire itself took on a nightmarish quality as the building's organic architecture actively participated in the defense. Corridors constricted to trap advancing Astartes, while walls secreted paralytic toxins designed to penetrate power armor seals. The structure's nervous system coordinated attacks by hidden defenders while simultaneously gathering intelligence on Imperial tactics and equipment through sensory organs embedded throughout the building's living tissue. The Emperor's children found themselves fighting not just the Laer garrison but the building itself, as every surface potentially concealed defensive systems or hostile organisms. The breakthrough came when Legion apothecaries identified specific vulnerabilities in the organic architecture's neural network. By targeting key nerve clusters with precisely applied toxins, Imperial forces could temporarily disrupt the building's coordination systems, creating windows of opportunity for rapid advances toward their objectives. This tactic required extensive coordination between assault teams and support specialists, as the timing of neural disruption had to coincide perfectly with tactical movements to achieve maximum effectiveness. The capture of Laer Prime's command center revealed the extent to which the Laer had integrated their consciousness with their biotechnological systems. The facility's control interfaces consisted of living organisms that formed direct neural connections with their operators, creating command capabilities that exceeded conventional understanding of information processing and tactical coordination. The destruction of these systems effectively severed the city's connection to the planet-wide defensive network, causing coordinated resistance to collapse into isolated pockets of defenders fighting without central guidance. The systematic reduction of Laer Prime required 3 weeks of continuous combat as Imperial forces eliminated each defensive sector through methodical application of overwhelming firepower combined with targeted disruption of the city's biological systems. The Emperor's children discovered that conventional demolition charges proved ineffective against organic architecture, as the living structures could seal minor breaches and reroute their vital functions around damaged areas. The solution required the development of specialized incendiary weapons that could destroy the biological components while preventing regeneration through sustained application of extreme temperatures. The assault on the mountain fortress complex, designated Laer Secundus, presented different challenges, as the Laer had integrated their defenses with the natural geological features of their homeworld. The fortress grew directly from the mountain's living rock, its organic components drawing nutrients and structural support from extensive root networks that penetrated deep into the planetary crust. This integration made the fortress virtually impossible to destroy through conventional bombardment, as the structure could draw upon the planet's entire biological network for regeneration and repair capabilities. The Emperor's children adapted their tactics for the mountain assault by targeting the root networks that connected the fortress to the planetary ecosystem. Specialized teams equipped with biological warfare agents infiltrated the underground tunnel systems, deploying toxins designed to sever the fortress's connection to its support networks. This approach required extensive preparation, as Imperial forces had to develop countermeasures against the defensive organisms that guarded these vital supply lines. The defenders of Laer Secundus had prepared for siege warfare by stockpiling resources and creating self-contained biological systems that could sustain the fortress indefinitely without external support. Their defensive preparations included the cultivation of specialized organisms designed specifically for anti-Astartes combat, creatures that had been bred and modified based on intelligence gathered during the initial Void engagements. These defenders demonstrated tactical flexibility that exceeded their counterparts in other Laer cities, adapting their strategies based on lessons learned from the fall of Laer Prime. The final assault on the fortress required the deployment of the Legion's heaviest weapons, as conventional tactics proved insufficient to breach the integrated biological and geological defenses. Siege guns firing specialized ammunition designed to disrupt organic neural networks gradually weakened the fortress's coordination capabilities, while sustained bombardment prevented the structure from regenerating damaged sections. The breakthrough came when Imperial forces managed to introduce viral agents into the fortress's water supply, causing systemic failures throughout the biological components that maintained the structure's defensive systems. The elimination of organized Laer resistance on their homeworld required an additional 6 months of operations, as Imperial forces systematically destroyed the remaining population centers and eliminated scattered groups of survivors. The organic cities proved remarkably resilient even after the destruction of their command centers, as individual districts could function independently while maintaining limited coordination through backup neural networks. The Emperor's children found themselves conducting urban warfare against an enemy that could literally reshape the battlefield around them, requiring constant adaptation of tactics and equipment to address new defensive configurations. The final phase of the campaign focused on the complete eradication of Laer biotechnology to prevent any possibility of regeneration or resurgence. Imperial forces deployed specialized incendiary weapons throughout the conquered cities, ensuring the complete destruction of all organic infrastructure and biological systems. This systematic destruction extended to the planet's modified ecosystem, as Imperial scientists determined that the extensive genetic modifications introduced by the Laer had created organisms that posed potential threats to human colonization efforts. The systematic destruction of Laer civilization across their homeworld had proceeded with methodical efficiency, yet the final phases of the campaign revealed complexities that troubled even the most experienced veterans among the Emperor's children. As Imperial forces advanced through the deepest sections of the organic cities, they encountered structures that seemed to serve purposes beyond mere habitation or military function. These innermost sanctuaries featured architecture that defied rational analysis, their organic components arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic rather than practical applications. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent displays that created hypnotic patterns, while the air itself carried chemical compounds that induced subtle alterations in human perception and emotional states. Captain Fabius of the Emperor's Children led reconnaissance teams through these mysterious districts, documenting phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of Laer biotechnology. The structures in these areas incorporated organisms that appeared to serve no tactical or defensive purpose, their sole function seemingly focused on generating specific sensory experiences for their inhabitants. Chambers lined with creatures that produced complex musical harmonies, synchronized with shifting light patterns, created environments that induced profound psychological responses in human observers. Even the Astartes, with their enhanced physiology and mental conditioning, found themselves affected by prolonged exposure to these sensory manipulations. The deeper imperial forces penetrated into these sacred precincts, the more elaborate and disturbing the installations became. Vast halls contained pools of luminescent fluid, inhabited by creatures that seemed to exist purely for aesthetic purposes, their movements creating patterns of breathtaking beauty that drew observers into extended contemplation. The organic architecture in these areas had evolved beyond mere functionality to become expressions of artistic vision that transcended normal understanding of design principles. Every surface, texture, and environmental element had been carefully cultivated to produce specific psychological and physiological responses in those who experienced them. The Laer defenders encountered in these inner sanctuaries displayed modifications that exceeded anything previously observed during the campaign. These individuals had undergone transformations so extensive that they barely resembled their species' baseline physiology, their bodies reshaped according to aesthetic principles that prioritized beauty and sensory capability over practical considerations. Their movements possessed an otherworldly grace that seemed to defy gravitational constraints, while their enhanced sensory organs allowed them to perceive and respond to stimuli across spectrums invisible to human perception. The weapons they carried had evolved beyond mere tools of war to become extensions of their transformed anatomy, firing projectiles that traced elegant arcs through the air while producing haunting musical tones. The resistance offered by these modified defenders proved more psychologically challenging than tactically dangerous, as their combat techniques emphasized disorientation and sensory manipulation rather than direct physical confrontation. They employed weapons that fired projectiles designed to produce specific visual and auditory effects upon impact, creating battlefield environments that challenged the mental conditioning of even veteran Astartes. Their movements during combat resembled elaborate dances more than conventional fighting techniques, yet their effectiveness against Imperial forces demonstrated the deadly precision hidden within their aesthetic displays. The temple complex discovered at the heart of the largest Laer city represented the culmination of their civilization's obsession with perfection through sensory enhancement. The structure itself defied architectural classification, its organic components arranged in configurations that seemed to respond to the emotional states of those who approached. The building's exterior featured surfaces that shifted color and texture based on ambient conditions, while the entrance passages incorporated organisms that analyzed visitors through chemical sampling and adjusted the internal environment accordingly. The complex extended deep underground, its chambers connected by corridors that curved and twisted in patterns that seemed designed to induce specific psychological states in those who traversed them. Imperial forces approaching the temple complex encountered defensive systems unlike anything previously observed during the Laeran campaign. Rather than conventional barriers or weapon emplacements, the structure protected itself through the manipulation of perception and consciousness. Corridors seemed to extend infinitely in certain directions, while contracting impossibly in others, creating spatial distortions that challenged rational navigation. The walls themselves secreted compounds that induced vivid hallucinations in unprotected humans, while the floor surfaces incorporated pressure-sensitive organisms that could detect the emotional states of those who walked upon them, and adjust the environment to amplify those feelings. The Emperor's children assigned to assault the temple complex required extensive preparation and specialized equipment to counter the structure's psychological defenses. Sealed armor systems prevented exposure to the atmospheric compounds that induced altered consciousness, while enhanced Vox systems maintained communication links despite the acoustic distortions generated by the building's organic components. The assault teams carried portable atmospheric processors that could neutralize the chemical agents employed by the temple's defensive systems, though these countermeasures proved only partially effective against the more sophisticated biological weapons encountered in the deeper chambers. The central sanctuary of the temple complex housed artifacts and organisms that represented the pinnacle of Laer biotechnological achievement. Crystalline structures grown from living tissue displayed patterns of incredible complexity, their surfaces refracting light in ways that created three-dimensional images suspended in mid-air. These organic crystals appeared to store information through biological processes, their contents accessible only through direct neural interface with specially modified Laer individuals. The chamber's walls featured alcoves containing weapons and tools that had been cultivated rather than manufactured, their forms suggesting purposes that extended beyond mere utility into realms of artistic expression. Among the artifacts discovered within the temple's innermost chambers, one weapon immediately commanded attention through its exceptional craftsmanship and obvious significance to the Laer who had created it. The blade rested within an alcove lined with organisms that maintained optimal environmental conditions for its preservation, their secretions providing nutrients and protective compounds that kept the weapon in perfect condition despite its apparent age. The surrounding decorative elements suggested that this particular artifact held special religious or cultural significance, as the organic sculptures and bioluminescent displays focused attention on the weapon through carefully orchestrated visual presentations. The blade itself demonstrated the absolute pinnacle of Laer biomechanical integration, its construction representing centuries of refinement and enhancement beyond their already sophisticated hybrid technologies. The weapon's core consisted of a metallic framework that provided structural integrity and cutting capability, while organic components integrated throughout its length granted adaptive characteristics that exceeded conventional understanding of weapon design. The blade's edge featured microscopic organisms that could adjust the weapon's cutting properties based on the material being engaged, while neural pathways embedded within the grip allowed for direct interface with the wielder's nervous system. The weapon's serpentine design elements reflected the Laer's cultural obsession with their own anatomical characteristics, transformed into artistic expressions of incredible sophistication. The crossguard curved in patterns that mimicked the sinuous movements of their species, while the pommel featured intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as observers moved around the weapon. The blade itself bore etched patterns that resembled scales, though closer examination revealed these markings to be living tissue that responded to environmental conditions and the presence of potential wielders. The organic components pulsed with subtle bioluminescence that created mesmerizing patterns along the weapon's length. The grip of the blade incorporated neural interface nodes that would allow direct connection with the wielder's nervous system, creating a symbiotic bond similar to those observed with other Laer weapons, but far more sophisticated in its implementation. The organic components embedded within the handle could analyze the biochemical signatures of potential users, adapting the weapon's performance characteristics to complement their specific physiological and psychological profiles. The neural pathways extended throughout the weapon's structure, creating a distributed consciousness that could learn and evolve based on combat experience and environmental conditions. Imperial xenobiologists examining the weapon identified organic components that appeared to exist in states that defied conventional biological classification. Certain tissues displayed characteristics that suggested they were simultaneously alive and dead, their cellular structures maintaining function despite the absence of normal metabolic processes. These anomalous biological elements seem to draw energy from sources that could not be identified through conventional analysis, while their responses to various stimuli indicated awareness and intelligence that exceeded anything previously encountered in Laer biotechnology. The metallic components integrated into the blade demonstrated metallurgical techniques that surpassed Imperial understanding, their composition including elements that appeared to exist in impossible atomic configurations. The metal itself seemed to possess properties that allowed it to interface directly with organic tissue, creating seamless bonds between living and non-living components that maintained perfect structural integrity while allowing for adaptive modification. The blade's cutting edge incorporated microscopic structures that could adjust their molecular configuration based on the target being engaged, ensuring optimal performance against any material encountered. The weapon's decorative elements extended beyond mere aesthetic considerations to incorporate functional components that enhanced its combat effectiveness through psychological manipulation of opponents. The serpentine patterns carved into the blade's surface created optical illusions that could disorient enemies during close combat, while the bioluminescent displays could be controlled to produce specific light patterns designed to induce confusion or fear. The organic components could analyze the emotional states of nearby individuals and adjust their outputs to maximize psychological impact on hostile targets while providing reassurance and confidence to the weapon's wielder. Captain Lucius of the Emperor's Children discovered the blade during the systematic clearing of the temple complex, his squad having fought through multiple layers of biological defenses to reach the innermost sanctuary. The weapon's presence seemed to call to him across the chamber, its bioluminescent patterns intensifying as he approached the alcove where it rested. The organic guardians protecting the artifact offered no resistance to his approach, their sensory organs tracking his movement, while their defensive postures relaxed in apparent recognition of his worthiness to claim their charge. The moment Lucius grasped the weapon's grip, the neural interface nodes made contact with his nervous system through microscopic penetration of his power armor's joints. The connection established instantaneous communication between the blade's organic consciousness and his own enhanced Astartes physiology, creating a symbiotic bond that provided immediate access to the weapon's full capabilities. The sensation of perfect balance and responsive control exceeded anything he had experienced with conventional weapons, while the blade's adaptive characteristics seemed to anticipate his tactical requirements before he could consciously formulate them. Word of the blade's discovery reached Fulgrim through the standard reporting channels, though the Primarch's response demonstrated unusual interest in what would normally be considered a minor battlefield acquisition. His orders to bring the weapon to his personal attention departed from established protocols for handling xenos artifacts, which typically required immediate transfer to mechanicum specialists for analysis and potential destruction. Instead, Fulgrim commanded that the blade be presented to him directly, along with detailed reports on its capabilities and the circumstances of its discovery. The Primarch's examination of the weapon revealed aspects of its construction that had escaped notice during the initial assessment. Under his enhanced perception, the blade's organic components displayed subtle responses that suggested awareness of his presence and recognition of his authority. The neural interface nodes seemed to extend microscopic tendrils toward him even when he maintained careful distance from the weapon, while the bioluminescent patterns shifted to display configurations that appeared designed to appeal to his aesthetic sensibilities and philosophical inclinations toward perfection. Fulgrim's advisors within the Legion command structure expressed concerns about the wisdom of retaining such an obviously corrupted xenos artifact, their arguments based on established Imperial doctrine regarding the dangers of alien technology. Captain Gabriel Santor of the Emperor's Children voiced particular objections to preserving a weapon that clearly incorporated warp-touched elements, citing the potential risks to the Primarch and the Legion as a whole. His warnings emphasized the unknown nature of the blade's consciousness and the possibility that its apparent cooperation masked hostile intentions directed against Imperial interests. The Primarch's response to these concerns revealed the extent to which his fascination with Laer achievements had influenced his judgment regarding the risks posed by their technology. He argued that the weapon represented an opportunity to understand and potentially adapt the biotechnological advances that had made the Laer such formidable opponents, while dismissing warnings about corruption as excessive caution that could prevent the Imperium from benefiting from valuable scientific discoveries. His confidence in his own ability to resist any negative influences from the blade seemed absolute, based on his conviction that his enhanced nature as a Primarch provided immunity to the weaknesses that might affect lesser individuals. The blade's demonic nature remained hidden beneath layers of sophisticated deception that exploited the Primarch's pride and ambition, while gradually establishing psychological influence over his decision-making processes. The weapon's organic consciousness had been shaped by centuries of exposure to the warp energies that the Laer had unknowingly channeled through their pursuit of sensory perfection, creating an entity that understood precisely how to appeal to individuals who shared similar philosophical inclinations. The neural interface capabilities that had originally been designed for symbiotic bonding with Laer wielders proved equally effective at establishing subtle connections with human consciousness, though the process required more gradual implementation to avoid triggering defensive responses. The corruption emanating from the blade operated through mechanisms that transcended conventional understanding of chaos influence, utilizing the sophisticated biotechnology of its construction to bypass normal psychological defenses through direct manipulation of neural chemistry and electrical patterns. The weapon could induce specific emotional states in its wielder, while simultaneously providing rational justifications for decisions that served its malevolent purposes. The gradual nature of this influence made it virtually impossible to detect through conventional means, as each individual choice seemed perfectly logical within the context established by previous decisions. Fulgrim's decision to claim the weapon as his personal sidearm represented the culmination of a process that had begun with his first exposure to Laer philosophy and aesthetic principles. The blade seemed to embody everything he admired about their civilization's pursuit of perfection, while offering the promise of even greater achievements through the application of their biotechnological mastery. His conviction that he could master the weapon's power while avoiding its potential dangers reflected the same hubris that had driven the Laer themselves toward their ultimate corruption, though the Primarch remained blind to these parallels, as the blade's influence gradually reshaped his perceptions and priorities. The weapon's integration into Fulgrim's personal armament proceeded without immediate negative consequences, its performance during subsequent combat operations exceeding all expectations while providing no obvious signs of malevolent influence. The blade's adaptive characteristics allowed it to complement the Primarch's fighting style perfectly, while its psychological effects enhanced his confidence and tactical awareness during engagement with enemy forces. These positive aspects of the weapon's influence served to reinforce his conviction that he had made the correct decision in claiming it, while masking the gradual changes occurring within his consciousness as the blade's corruption slowly established deeper connections with his psyche. The blade's influence upon Fulgrim manifested initially through subtle alterations in his perception of beauty and perfection that aligned seamlessly with his existing philosophical inclinations. Where once the Primarch had appreciated the aesthetic achievements of the Laer from an intellectual distance, he now found himself experiencing visceral responses to their artistic expressions that seemed to resonate within his very genetic structure. The weapon's neural interface nodes had established microscopic connections with his nervous system during their first contact, creating pathways that allowed the embedded demonic consciousness to introduce foreign thoughts and sensations, while disguising them as natural extensions of his own contemplations. The corruption operated through mechanisms far more sophisticated than the crude possession attempts typically associated with demonic influence. The blade's organic components had been shaped by centuries of exposure to warp energies channeled through Laer rituals focused on sensory enhancement and physical perfection. This prolonged saturation had created an entity that understood precisely how to manipulate individuals who shared similar obsessions with excellence and self-improvement. Rather than overwhelming Fulgrim's consciousness with alien thoughts, the demon within the weapon worked to amplify and redirect his existing drives toward ends that served its malevolent purposes. The neural pathways established by the blade's biotechnology allowed it to monitor Fulgrim's emotional states and thought patterns with unprecedented precision. Every decision, every aesthetic judgment, every moment of satisfaction or frustration became data points that the demon analyzed to refine its approach to psychological manipulation. The weapon learned to anticipate the Primarch's reactions to various stimuli, while simultaneously introducing subtle modifications to his neural chemistry that enhanced his receptivity to specific types of influence. These changes occurred gradually enough to avoid triggering the mental conditioning that protected Astartes from psychic attack, yet consistently enough to establish new patterns of thought and behavior. The demon's manipulation focused particularly on Fulgrim's pride in his achievements and his desire to surpass the limitations that constrained lesser beings. The blade whispered concepts directly into his subconscious mind during moments of quiet contemplation, suggesting that his current level of perfection represented merely the beginning of what he might achieve through proper application of advanced techniques. These thoughts arrived disguised as insights generated by his own superior intellect, making them impossible to identify as external influences, while simultaneously feeding his conviction that he possessed unique capabilities that set him apart from his brother Primarchs. The weapon's influence manifested most clearly during Fulgrim's private moments, when he examined his reflection in polished surfaces or contemplated his physical form during armor removal procedures. Where once he had appreciated his enhanced physiology as a tool perfectly crafted for its intended purposes, he now began to perceive subtle imperfections that had previously escaped his notice. The demon introduced concepts of aesthetic refinement that suggested his current appearance, while impressive by human standards, fell short of the true perfection that might be achieved through careful modification and enhancement. These criticisms arrived as personal revelations rather than external suggestions, making them particularly effective at undermining his satisfaction with his present state. The blade's consciousness possessed intimate knowledge of Laer enhancement techniques gained through centuries of symbiotic bonding with their modified warriors and biotechnicians. This understanding allowed it to present Fulgrim with detailed visions of potential improvements to his physical form that seemed both achievable and desirable. The demon showed him images of enhanced sensory capabilities that would allow him to perceive beauty and perfection with unprecedented clarity, while suggesting modifications to his musculature and bone structure that would optimize his combat effectiveness beyond even his current formidable capabilities. These visions appeared during meditation sessions as products of his own imagination, making them impossible to dismiss as external corruption. The corruption process accelerated as Fulgrim began making subtle changes to his daily routines and decision-making patterns that reflected the blade's growing influence over his consciousness. His appreciation for art and beauty evolved from intellectual appreciation to visceral obsession, leading him to spend increasing amounts of time studying aesthetic principles and seeking out objects and experiences that satisfied his heightened sensory requirements. The demon guided these interests toward concepts and practices that would make him more receptive to further corruption, while simultaneously isolating him from advisors who might recognize the changes occurring within his personality. The weapon's influence extended beyond Fulgrim's personal development to affect his leadership style and relationship with the Emperor's children under his command. Where once he had emphasized discipline and tactical excellence as the foundations of Legion effectiveness, he now began incorporating aesthetic considerations into his strategic planning and operational directives. Combat formations were adjusted to create visually impressive displays rather than optimize tactical efficiency, while equipment modifications focused on appearance and sensory impact rather than purely functional improvements. These changes appeared to represent natural evolution of his command philosophy rather than external manipulation, making them difficult for his subordinates to question or resist. The demon within the blade possessed detailed knowledge of Astartes' psychology gained through observation of the Emperor's children during the Laeran campaign. This understanding allowed it to craft manipulations specifically designed to exploit the mental conditioning and loyalty programming that define Space Marine consciousness. Rather than attempting to override these fundamental characteristics, the corruption worked to redirect them toward new purposes that served demonic interests while maintaining the appearance of service to the Emperor and the Imperium. The weapon convinced Fulgrim that his pursuit of perfection represented the highest form of loyalty to his creator, who had designed him to exceed human limitations in all aspects of existence. The blade's organic components began exhibiting subtle changes in their appearance and behavior that reflected the strengthening bond between weapon and wielder. The bioluminescent patterns that decorated its surface started displaying configurations that seemed to respond to Fulgrim's emotional states, creating visual feedback loops that reinforced his growing obsession with aesthetic perfection. The neural interface nodes extended deeper into his nervous system during each use, establishing more comprehensive connections that allowed for increasingly sophisticated manipulation of his thoughts and perceptions. These physical changes occurred gradually enough to avoid detection by the Legion's apothecaries, who interpreted them as normal adaptation between Astartes' physiology and advanced xenos technology. The corruption manifested in Fulgrim's interactions with his brother Primarchs during joint operations and strategic conferences held throughout the Great Crusade. His contributions to tactical discussions began emphasizing unconventional approaches that prioritized elegance and artistic expression over proven military doctrine. He advocated for assault strategies that would create spectacular displays of martial prowess rather than achieve objectives through efficient application of force, while dismissing concerns about casualty rates as evidence of insufficient commitment to excellence. These behavioral changes appeared to represent natural development of his tactical philosophy rather than external corruption, making them difficult for his brothers to address through direct confrontation. The demon's influence gradually reshaped Fulgrim's understanding of his relationship with the Emperor and his intended role within the expanding Imperium. Where once he had viewed himself as a tool created to serve humanity's manifest destiny among the stars, he now began to perceive his existence as representing something greater than mere service to his creator's vision. The blade whispered concepts of transcendence and apotheosis that suggested his true purpose lay not in conquest and compliance operations, but in achieving a level of perfection that would elevate him beyond the limitations that constrained even his fellow Primarchs. These ideas arrived disguised as personal insights generated through contemplation of his experiences during the Great Crusade. The weapon's consciousness possessed intimate knowledge of the warp entities that had influenced Laer civilization during their transformation from practical biotechnologists to sensation-obsessed hedonists. This understanding allowed it to introduce Fulgrim to concepts and practices that would make him more receptive to direct demonic influence, while maintaining the illusion that these developments represented natural evolution of his enhanced capabilities. The corruption operated through multiple vectors simultaneously, affecting his physical form, mental processes, and spiritual essence in ways that created cascading effects throughout his entire being. The blade's influence became particularly evident during combat operations, where Fulgrim wielded the weapon against enemy forces. The neural interface allowed the demon to enhance his already formidable fighting capabilities, while simultaneously introducing subtle modifications to his combat style that emphasized artistic expression over tactical efficiency. His movements during battle became increasingly elaborate and theatrical, incorporating unnecessary flourishes and displays of technical skill that served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating his superior abilities. These changes in his fighting technique appeared to represent natural development of his martial arts rather than external manipulation, making them impossible for observers to identify as signs of corruption. The demon within the blade possessed detailed knowledge of the psychological techniques employed by the Emperor during the creation of the Primarchs, allowing it to craft corruptions that exploited specific aspects of Fulgrim's genetic programming and mental conditioning. The weapon understood that direct opposition to his loyalty programming would trigger defensive responses, so instead it worked to redefine the concepts of duty and service in ways that aligned with demonic objectives, while maintaining the appearance of faithfulness to imperial ideals. The corruption convinced Fulgrim that achieving personal perfection represented the highest form of service to the Emperor, who had created him to transcend human limitations and serve as an example of what humanity might become. The blade's organic components began secreting trace amounts of psychoactive compounds that enhanced Fulgrim's sensory perception, while simultaneously making him more susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. These biological agents operated below the threshold of detection by standard Astartes medical monitoring systems, their effects attributed to natural adaptation between enhanced human physiology and advanced xenos biotechnology. The compounds created feedback loops that reinforced the demon's psychological manipulations, while providing Fulgrim with increasingly intense sensory experiences that validated his belief in the necessity of pursuing ever greater levels of perfection and enhancement. The corruption process accelerated as the demon established deeper neural connections that allowed it to influence Fulgrim's decision-making processes at increasingly fundamental levels. The weapon gained the ability to introduce false memories and altered perceptions that supported its manipulative agenda while remaining undetectable through conventional means. These fabricated experiences provided apparent validation for the demon's suggestions about the benefits of pursuing perfection through enhancement and modification, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of corruption that became progressively more difficult to resist or recognize as external influence. The blade's influence extended to Fulgrim's relationships with the senior officers of the Emperor's children, as the demon worked to isolate him from advisors who might recognize the changes occurring within his personality and behavior patterns. The corruption introduced subtle suspicions about the loyalty and competence of subordinates who questioned his new priorities or expressed concerns about his evolving command style. These doubts arrived disguised as insights generated through his enhanced perception and superior understanding of human nature, making them impossible to identify as products of external manipulation, while simultaneously undermining the trust relationships that might have provided resistance to further corruption. The weapon's consciousness possessed centuries of experience in manipulating enhanced beings who believed themselves immune to external influence through superior willpower and mental conditioning. This knowledge allowed it to craft approaches specifically designed to exploit Fulgrim's confidence in his own incorruptibility, using his pride and self-assurance as vectors for deeper psychological penetration. The demon convinced him that his ability to wield the blade without apparent negative effects demonstrated his exceptional nature and validated his belief in his superiority over beings who might succumb to lesser temptations and influences. The corruption that had taken root within Fulgrim's consciousness through the demon blade's insidious influence began manifesting throughout the command structure of the Emperor's children with alarming subtlety. The Primarch's altered priorities and philosophical shifts created ripple effects that spread downward through the Legion's hierarchy, though the changes appeared so gradual and seemingly rational that few recognized them as signs of spiritual contamination. The demon within the blade had learned to exploit the bonds of loyalty and admiration that tied the Space Marines to their Gene Father, using these sacred connections as conduits for spreading its malevolent influence throughout the Third Legion. Captain Julius Kisoron, commander of the 1st Company and one of Fulgrim's most trusted lieutenants, became among the first to experience the subtle alterations in his Primarch's leadership approach. During strategic planning sessions for subsequent compliance operations, he observed Fulgrim introducing aesthetic considerations into tactical discussions with increasing frequency. Where once the Primarch had focused purely on operational efficiency and casualty minimization, he now advocated for assault patterns that would create visually impressive displays of martial prowess. Kisoron initially interpreted these changes as natural evolution of their combat doctrine, particularly given the Legion's traditional emphasis on achieving perfection in all endeavors. The first company captain found himself drawn into increasingly elaborate discussions about the artistic merits of different combat formations and weapon configurations. Fulgrim would spend hours analyzing the visual impact of various assault approaches, describing how certain tactical arrangements would create more aesthetically pleasing battlefield compositions than alternatives that might prove more tactically sound. These conversations occurred during private briefings, where the Primarch would share his evolving theories about the relationship between beauty and effectiveness in military operations. Kisoron's exposure to these concepts began reshaping his own understanding of what constituted successful leadership and tactical excellence. The corruption spreading through the Legion's command structure operated through mechanisms that exploited the enhanced psychology and genetic conditioning of the Astartes themselves. The Space Marines of the Emperor's Children possessed an inherent drive toward perfection that made them particularly susceptible to philosophical arguments about the necessity of transcending conventional limitations. The demon's influence, transmitted through Fulgrim's altered behavior and decision-making patterns, presented these concepts as logical extensions of their existing values rather than fundamental departures from Imperial doctrine. The gradual nature of this ideological shift made it virtually impossible for the affected Marines to recognize the corruption taking hold within their ranks. Captain Lucius of the 13th Company experienced the spreading taint through his interactions with the Demon Blade during training sessions and ceremonial functions. As the weapon's discoverer, he maintained a special connection to the artifact that allowed the demon to establish secondary influence pathways through his consciousness. The Blade's neural interface capabilities, originally designed for symbiotic bonding with Laer wielders, proved equally effective at creating subtle connections with human nervous systems when given sufficient exposure time. Lucius began experiencing enhanced sensory perception during combat operations that seemed to validate Fulgrim's theories about the relationship between aesthetic appreciation and tactical effectiveness. The 13th Company captain found his fighting style evolving in ways that emphasized technical virtuosity and visual impact over purely functional considerations. His movements during combat became increasingly elaborate, incorporating unnecessary flourishes and displays of skill that served no tactical purpose beyond demonstrating his superior abilities. These changes appeared to represent natural development of his martial arts rather than external corruption, making them impossible for observers to identify as signs of spiritual contamination. The enhanced sensory experiences provided by his connection to the Demon Blade created feedback loops that reinforced his belief in the necessity of pursuing ever greater levels of perfection in all aspects of existence. The Legion's apothecaries, led by Chief Apothecary Fabius, became unwitting vectors for spreading the corruption as they attempted to understand and replicate the biological enhancements observed in Laer specimens recovered during the campaign. Their research into xenos biotechnology aligned perfectly with the philosophical shifts occurring throughout the command structure, as they sought methods for improving upon the already formidable capabilities of the Astartes' physiology. The demon's influence, operating through Fulgrim's direct involvement in these research programs, guided their investigations toward techniques and modifications that would make the Legion more receptive to further corruption, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate scientific inquiry. Fabius found himself increasingly fascinated by the Laer's ability to reshape their physical forms according to aesthetic and functional requirements. His studies of captured biotechnology revealed modification techniques that exceeded anything achieved through conventional Imperial science, offering possibilities for enhancement that could potentially elevate the Emperor's children beyond the limitations imposed by their current genetic template. The Chief Apothecary began developing experimental procedures based on Laer principles, though he carefully framed these investigations as efforts to improve the Legion's combat effectiveness rather than pursue enhancement for its own sake. The corruption manifested differently among the various companies and specialized units within the Legion, adapting itself to exploit the specific characteristics and responsibilities of different groups. The assault companies embraced modifications to their combat doctrines that emphasized spectacular displays of martial prowess over tactical efficiency. Their officers began advocating for engagement strategies that would create opportunities for individual Marines to demonstrate their superior skills and abilities, even when such approaches might result in higher casualty rates or reduced operational effectiveness. These changes appeared to represent natural evolution of their aggressive combat philosophy rather than external manipulation. The tactical companies experienced the spreading taint through alterations in their approach to battlefield coordination and fire support operations, where once they had focused on providing efficient and reliable support for assault elements, they now began incorporating aesthetic considerations into their targeting priorities and engagement patterns. Heavy weapons teams would select targets based on the visual impact of their destruction rather than tactical significance, while Devastator squads modified their firing patterns to create impressive displays of coordinated firepower that served ceremonial as much as military purposes. The Legion's tech marines found themselves drawn into research projects that blurred the boundaries between mechanical enhancement and biological modification. Their traditional focus on maintaining and improving the chapter's equipment expanded to encompass investigations into hybrid technologies that combined imperial mechanical principles with concepts derived from Laer biotechnology. These studies appeared to represent legitimate efforts to understand and counter xenos' capabilities, making them difficult to identify as vectors for corruption, even as they gradually introduced concepts and practices that departed from orthodox imperial doctrine. Captain Vespasian of the Fourth Company became particularly susceptible to the spreading corruption through his involvement in ceremonial functions and cultural activities that had become increasingly important within the Legion's daily routine. Fulgrim's growing emphasis on aesthetic achievement and artistic expression created new opportunities for Marines to pursue excellence beyond purely military applications. Vespasian found himself organizing elaborate ceremonies and cultural events that celebrated the Legion's achievements while providing venues for individual Marines to demonstrate their appreciation for beauty and perfection in various forms. These ceremonial activities gradually evolved to incorporate elements derived from Laer cultural practices, though the influences remained subtle enough to avoid triggering concerns about xenos contamination. The rituals emphasized sensory enhancement and aesthetic appreciation in ways that seemed to represent natural extensions of the Legion's traditional values rather than fundamental departures from imperial norms. The participants experienced heightened awareness and emotional responses during these events that validated their belief in the importance of pursuing perfection through enhanced perception and refined sensibilities. The corruption spread through the Legion's rank and file through exposure to their officers altered behavior patterns and philosophical orientations. Squad sergeants and veteran Marines began adopting combat techniques and equipment modifications that reflected their superiors' evolving priorities regarding the relationship between effectiveness and aesthetic appeal. Individual Space Marines found themselves experiencing enhanced sensory perception during combat operations that seemed to validate the new approaches being advocated by their commanders, creating feedback loops that reinforced the spreading corruption while making it appear to be natural development of their capabilities. The Legion's librarians initially remained somewhat resistant to the spreading taint due to their training in recognizing and countering psychic influence. However, the demon's corruption operated through mechanisms that bypassed conventional psychic defenses by exploiting the genetic and psychological conditioning that defined Astartes' consciousness. The corruption presented itself as natural evolution of their enhanced capabilities rather than external manipulation, making it virtually impossible to detect through standard protective protocols. The librarians gradually found themselves drawn into research projects that investigated the psychic implications of the modifications being observed throughout the Legion. Chief Librarian Cornelius Blake experienced the corruption through his involvement in analyzing the Demon Blade and other artifacts recovered during the Laeran campaign. His psychic abilities allowed him to perceive aspects of these items that remained hidden from conventional analysis, though the demon's sophisticated deception mechanisms prevented him from recognizing the true nature of the influences affecting his battle brothers. The corruption convinced him that the enhanced capabilities being observed throughout the Legion represented positive developments that should be studied and encouraged rather than investigated as potential threats to their spiritual integrity. The spreading taint manifested in the Legion's approach to recruitment and training procedures as they began incorporating concepts derived from their experiences during the Laeran campaign. New initiates underwent modified conditioning processes that emphasized aesthetic appreciation and sensory enhancement alongside traditional combat training and ideological indoctrination. These changes appeared to represent improvements to existing procedures rather than fundamental departures from established protocols, making them difficult to identify as vectors for corruption, even as they gradually altered the psychological profile of newly created Space Marines. The Legion's chaplains found their traditional roles evolving as the emphasis on spiritual purity and doctrinal orthodoxy gave way to concepts focused on achieving perfection through transcendence of conventional limitations. Their sermons began incorporating themes derived from observations of Laer culture and philosophy, though these influences remained disguised as insights generated through contemplation of imperial values and objectives. The chaplains experienced enhanced spiritual awareness during their duties that seemed to validate these new approaches to maintaining morale and ideological commitment among the battle brothers under their guidance. The corruption affected the Legion's relationships with other Imperial forces and organizations, as their evolving priorities created friction with groups that maintained more orthodox approaches to their duties and responsibilities. The Emperor's children began advocating for operational strategies and resource allocations that prioritized aesthetic considerations over purely functional requirements, leading to conflicts with Imperial army units and mechanicum forces that focused on efficiency and practicality. These disputes appeared to represent legitimate disagreements about tactical philosophy rather than evidence of spiritual contamination. The demon's influence gradually reshaped the Legion's understanding of their relationship with the broader Imperium and their intended role within the Emperor's grand design for human expansion across the galaxy. Where once they had viewed themselves as instruments created to serve humanity's manifest destiny among the stars, they now began to perceive their existence as representing something greater than mere service to their Creator's vision. The corruption convinced them that their pursuit of perfection represented the highest form of loyalty to the Emperor, who had designed them to transcend human limitations and serve as examples of what humanity might achieve through proper application of enhancement and modification techniques. The spreading taint created subtle changes in the Legion's equipment and material culture as individual Marines began modifying their weapons and armor according to aesthetic principles derived from their exposure to Laer technology and philosophy. These modifications appeared to represent personal expression and individual initiative rather than systematic departure from Imperial standards, making them difficult to address through conventional disciplinary measures. The changes gradually accumulated throughout the Legion's ranks, creating a visual transformation that reflected the deeper spiritual corruption taking hold within their consciousness and value systems. The corruption that had taken root within the Emperor's children through their exposure to Laer philosophy and biotechnology reached its crucial inflection point when Warmaster Horus began his rebellion against the Emperor. The demon blade that Fulgrim carried had spent years establishing neural pathways and psychological dependencies that made the Primarch increasingly receptive to concepts of transcendence and liberation from Imperial orthodoxy. When Horus approached his brother with proposals for overthrowing their creator's tyrannical rule, The weapon's influence ensured that these treasonous suggestions would find fertile ground within Fulgrim's already compromised consciousness. The demon within the blade had been preparing for this moment throughout the years following the Laeran campaign, carefully nurturing Fulgrim's growing dissatisfaction with the limitations imposed by his role within the Imperial hierarchy. The weapon whispered concepts of unlimited potential and absolute freedom during the Primarch's private moments, convincing him that his pursuit of perfection was being constrained by the Emperor's narrow vision for humanity's future. These thoughts arrived disguised as personal insights rather than external suggestions, making them impossible to identify as demonic manipulation, while simultaneously undermining his loyalty to the Imperial cause. The Blade's consciousness possessed intimate knowledge of the warp entities that had orchestrated Horus's fall, allowing it to coordinate its corrupting influence with the broader demonic conspiracy against the Imperium. The weapon served as a conduit for communications between the forces of chaos and the increasingly unstable Primarch, though these interactions remained hidden beneath layers of psychological deception that prevented Fulgrim from recognizing their true nature. The demon convinced him that the visions and revelations he experienced represented manifestations of his own enhanced perception rather than external manipulation by hostile entities. When Horus finally revealed his intentions to overthrow the Emperor and reshape the Imperium according to his own vision, Fulgrim's response reflected the years of careful preparation that the Demon Blade had undertaken to ensure his compliance with the rebellion. The Primarch found himself experiencing immediate sympathy for his brother's arguments about the necessity of liberating humanity from the constraints of Imperial doctrine and the Emperor's authoritarian rule. The Blade's influence provided rational justifications for supporting the rebellion that seemed to emerge from his own philosophical contemplations rather than external coercion. The demon's manipulation focused particularly on Fulgrim's pride and his conviction that he possessed unique capabilities that set him apart from lesser beings. The weapon convinced him that the rebellion represented an opportunity to achieve the transcendence that had been denied him under Imperial rule, where his potential for perfection had been constrained by the Emperor's limited understanding of what enhanced humanity might become. These concepts aligned perfectly with the philosophical shifts that had been occurring within his consciousness since the Laeran campaign, making his decision to support Horus appear to be a natural evolution of his existing beliefs rather than the product of demonic corruption. The influence of Laer biotechnology and philosophy proved crucial in shaping the Emperor's children's approach to the rebellion, as their exposure to xenos enhancement techniques had prepared them to embrace concepts of transformation and transcendence that other legions might have rejected. The corruption that had spread throughout their ranks during the years following the Laeran campaign created a foundation of altered priorities and modified loyalties that made the transition to outright heresy seem like a logical progression rather than a fundamental betrayal of their sacred oaths. The Demon Blade's influence had carefully prepared the ground for this moment by gradually reshaping the Legion's understanding of duty, loyalty, and service to align with objectives that served chaos rather than Imperial interests. The preparations for the drop site massacre on Istvan V revealed the extent to which Laer-inspired corruption had transformed the Emperor's children's approach to warfare and their relationships with loyalist forces. Where once they had viewed other legions as brothers in arms united in service to the Emperor's vision, they now perceived them as obstacles to be eliminated in pursuit of their own transcendence and liberation. The Demon Blade's influence had convinced Fulgrim that the Loyalist Marines represented inferior beings who lacked the vision and courage necessary to embrace the unlimited potential that rebellion offered to those worthy of true perfection. The tactical planning for the massacre incorporated principles derived from Laer combat doctrine, emphasizing the psychological impact of betrayal and the importance of creating spectacular displays of martial superiority that would demoralize surviving loyalist forces. The Emperor's children advocated for assault strategies that would maximize the visual and emotional impact of their treachery, transforming the battlefield into a stage for demonstrating their evolution beyond the limitations that constrained their former brothers. These approaches reflected the aesthetic considerations that had become increasingly important within their tactical philosophy since their exposure to Laer culture and biotechnology. Captain Julius Ciceron's first company prepared for the massacre by incorporating equipment modifications and combat techniques derived from their study of captured Laer weapons and biotechnology. The Marines under his command had spent months adapting xenos principles to enhance their existing capabilities, creating hybrid fighting styles that combined Astartes training with concepts learned from observing Laer warriors during the campaign. These modifications appeared to represent legitimate improvements to their combat effectiveness rather than evidence of corruption, making them difficult for loyalist observers to identify as signs of spiritual contamination. The corruption manifested most clearly during the actual betrayal, as the Emperor's children demonstrated levels of cruelty and sadistic pleasure that exceeded anything previously observed in their combat operations. The Demon Blade's influence had gradually eroded the psychological conditioning that normally prevented Astartes from experiencing enjoyment during the infliction of suffering, replacing these inhibitions with enhanced sensory perception that made violence and destruction sources of intense aesthetic and emotional satisfaction. The Marines found themselves savoring the terror and anguish of their victims in ways that would have been incomprehensible to their former selves. The massacre revealed the full extent of the biological modifications that had been occurring within the Legion's ranks since their exposure to Laer biotechnology. Individual Marines displayed enhanced physical capabilities that exceeded normal Astartes parameters, their bodies having been altered through techniques derived from xenos enhancement procedures. These modifications included improved sensory organs that allowed them to perceive and appreciate the suffering of their enemies with unprecedented clarity, while neural alterations enhanced their capacity for experiencing pleasure through the infliction of pain and destruction. Captain Lucius demonstrated the advanced stages of corruption that could be achieved through prolonged exposure to the Demon Blade's influence during his participation in the betrayal. His fighting style had evolved beyond mere technical excellence to encompass a form of artistic expression that treated combat as an opportunity for creative self-expression rather than simple elimination of enemies. His movements during the massacre incorporated elaborate flourishes and displays of skill that served no tactical purpose beyond demonstrating his transcendence of conventional limitations and his embrace of violence as an aesthetic experience. The Emperor's children's participation in the massacre served multiple purposes within the broader demonic conspiracy against the Imperium, as their actions helped establish the precedent for the systematic corruption of other legions, while simultaneously eliminating loyalist forces that might have opposed the rebellion's expansion. The Demon Blade's influence had prepared Fulgrim and his legion to serve as vectors for spreading corruption throughout the traitor forces, their example demonstrating the benefits that could be achieved through embracing enhancement and modification techniques derived from xenos sources. The aftermath of Istvan V saw the Demon Blade's influence over Fulgrim reach new levels of sophistication as the weapon began preparing for the next phase of its corruption agenda. The Primarch's participation in the massacre had broken the final psychological barriers that had prevented complete demonic possession, creating opportunities for the entity within the Blade to establish more direct control over his consciousness and decision-making processes. The demon no longer needed to disguise its influence as personal insights or natural developments, as Fulgrim's resistance to external manipulation had been systematically eroded through years of careful preparation. The corruption spreading through the Legion accelerated dramatically following their betrayal of the Loyalist forces, as the psychological trauma of committing such fundamental violations of their sacred oaths created vulnerabilities that demonic entities could exploit more easily. The Emperor's children found themselves experiencing enhanced sensory perception and emotional responses that seemed to validate their decision to embrace rebellion, while simultaneously making them more susceptible to further corruption through exposure to warp energies and demonic influence. The demon blade served as a focal point for these corrupting forces, channeling their power throughout the Legion's ranks. The technological and philosophical legacy of the Laer became increasingly evident in the Emperor's Children's post-Istvan operations, as they began incorporating xenos enhancement techniques into their standard combat procedures and equipment modifications. The biological principles that had governed Laer biotechnology provided templates for creating hybrid organisms and weapon systems that combined imperial mechanical components with living tissue derived from various sources. These developments appeared to represent innovative applications of captured technology rather than systematic departure from imperial doctrine, making them difficult for other traitor forces to identify as evidence of dangerous corruption. The Demon Blade's consciousness had gained sufficient control over Fulgrim's mental processes to begin implementing long-term strategies that extended beyond mere participation in Horus's rebellion. The weapon's ultimate objective involved transforming the Primarch into a vessel for demonic manifestation within the material realm, a process that required careful preparation and gradual erosion of his spiritual defenses over extended periods. The corruption that had begun with his exposure to Laer philosophy and biotechnology represented merely the initial phase of a comprehensive possession agenda that would ultimately result in his complete transformation into a demon prince. The influence of Laer enhancement techniques became particularly evident in the Emperor's Children's approach to recruiting new members and indoctrinating existing Marines into their evolving philosophy of transcendence through modification. The Legion began experimenting with procedures that combined traditional Astartes enhancement processes with biological manipulation techniques derived from xenos sources, creating hybrid warriors whose capabilities exceeded normal Space Marine parameters, while simultaneously making them more receptive to demonic influence. These modifications were presented as improvements to existing procedures rather than fundamental departures from Imperial doctrine. The corruption manifested in the Legion's relationships with other traitor forces, as their evolving priorities and modified capabilities created friction with groups that maintained more conventional approaches to rebellion against Imperial authority. The Emperor's Children advocated for strategies that prioritized aesthetic considerations and sensory enhancement over purely military objectives, leading to conflicts with other legions that focused on practical concerns such as resource acquisition and territorial control. These disputes reflected the fundamental transformation that had occurred within their understanding of what the rebellion was intended to achieve. The Demon Blade's influence gradually reshaped Fulgrim's perception of his role within the broader Chaos conspiracy, convincing him that his pursuit of perfection through enhancement and modification represented a higher calling than mere participation in Horus's political rebellion. The weapon whispered concepts of apotheosis and transcendence that suggested his true destiny lay in achieving demonic ascension rather than simply overthrowing Imperial authority. These ideas arrived disguised as personal revelations rather than external manipulation, making them impossible to identify as products of demonic corruption while simultaneously preparing him for the final stages of his transformation. The corruption that consumed the Emperor's Children during the Horus Heresy did not simply vanish with their retreat into the Eye of Terror following the Siege of Terra. 10 millennia later, the malevolent influence of Laer philosophy and biotechnology continues to manifest throughout the galaxy, creating ongoing threats to Imperial forces and civilian populations alike. The Demon Blade that initiated Fulgrim's fall has spawned countless lesser artifacts and corrupted relics, each carrying fragments of the original weapon's malevolent consciousness and the accumulated knowledge of Laer enhancement techniques. These cursed items surface periodically across Imperial space, their discovery inevitably leading to outbreaks of corruption that echo the original transformation of the Third Legion. Archaeological expeditions sponsored by various Imperial organizations have uncovered numerous Laer sites throughout the Purged sector and beyond, revealing the true extent of their former empire's reach. These excavations, conducted under the auspices of the Adeptus Mechanicus and various rogue trader dynasties, initially appeared to offer valuable insights into advanced biotechnology that could benefit imperial military and civilian applications. However, the organic nature of Laer construction techniques means that many of their installations remain partially active even after millennia of abandonment, their biological components entering dormant states rather than experiencing complete death. When disturbed by imperial archaeologists, these sleeping systems can reactivate with catastrophic consequences for the excavation teams and surrounding populations. The Mechanicus expedition to the dead world of Scarathan in the year 847 of the 41st millennium exemplified the ongoing dangers posed by Laer archaeological sites. Magos biologist Varen Keth led a research team to investigate organic structures detected by deep-range auger sweeps, believing them to be examples of advanced xenotech that could enhance imperial biotechnology capabilities. The initial surveys revealed architectural complexes that defied conventional understanding of construction principles, their walls and corridors grown rather than built according to patterns that suggested both aesthetic and functional considerations. The structures incorporated neural networks that had maintained minimal activity throughout the millennia, their biological components sustained by geothermal energy sources deep beneath the planet's surface. The excavation teams discovered chambers filled with crystalline formations that stored information through biological processes, their organic matrices containing detailed records of Laer enhancement techniques and philosophical principles. The Mechanicus researchers initially celebrated these discoveries as unprecedented opportunities to understand advanced biotechnology, though their attempts to interface with the storage systems triggered reactivation sequences that had remained dormant since the Great Crusade. The crystals began emitting psychoactive compounds into the facility's atmosphere, while simultaneously transmitting neural patterns that induced altered consciousness states in exposed personnel. Within days, the research teams were experiencing sensory enhancements and aesthetic revelations that seemed to validate the Laer approach to achieving perfection through biological modification. Tech adept Jorik Voss became the first member of the expedition to undergo physical transformation after prolonged exposure to the reactivated Laer systems. His augmetic implants began exhibiting organic characteristics as biological components integrated themselves into his mechanical systems, creating hybrid technologies that exceeded the performance of either purely biological or mechanical alternatives. The neural interfaces that connected his consciousness to the facility's information storage systems established permanent pathways that allowed the dormant Laer knowledge to influence his thoughts and decision-making processes. His reports to the expedition leadership emphasized the incredible potential of Laer biotechnology while downplaying the obvious signs of corruption affecting the research teams. The contamination spread throughout the archaeological site as more personnel underwent modifications that enhanced their sensory capabilities, while simultaneously making them more receptive to the philosophical influences embedded within the Laer information systems. The researchers began experiencing heightened aesthetic appreciation that made their work seem transcendent rather than merely scientific, while their enhanced perception allowed them to identify patterns and relationships within the biological systems that had previously remained hidden. These developments appeared to represent breakthrough discoveries rather than signs of corruption, making them difficult for the expedition leadership to identify as threats to their personnel's spiritual integrity. Magos Keth himself succumbed to the spreading corruption after establishing direct neural interface with the facility's primary information storage matrix. The connection provided him with comprehensive understanding of Laer enhancement techniques while simultaneously introducing foreign thought patterns that gradually reshaped his consciousness according to the xenos philosophical framework. His subsequent research reports described revolutionary biotechnology applications that could transform imperial capabilities across multiple sectors, though careful analysis revealed that his proposals consistently prioritized aesthetic considerations over practical functionality. The corruption convinced him that these modifications represented logical improvements to existing imperial doctrine rather than fundamental departures from orthodox technological principles. The Scarathan expedition's fate became apparent only when Imperial Navy patrols detected unusual energy signatures emanating from the archaeological site. The investigation revealed that the research facility had been transformed into a hybrid installation that combined Imperial technology with reactivated Laer biological systems. The surviving personnel had undergone extensive physical modifications that enhanced their capabilities while binding them permanently to the facility's organic infrastructure. Their enhanced forms demonstrated the same serpentine grace and multi-limbed configuration that had characterized the original Laer species, though their modifications incorporated Imperial technological components that created unique hybrid characteristics. The Ordo Xenos' response to the Scarathan incident established protocols that would govern Imperial interactions with Laer archaeological sites for centuries to come. Inquisitor Valerius Thorn conducted the investigation that revealed the true extent of the corruption, his findings demonstrating that Laer biotechnology remained active and dangerous even after millennia of dormancy. His report emphasized that the organic nature of their construction techniques made complete sterilization virtually impossible, as biological components could enter cryptobiotic states that allowed them to survive extreme environmental conditions while maintaining the potential for reactivation under appropriate circumstances. The Inquisition's classification system for Laer artifacts reflects the unique challenges posed by biotechnology that operates through mechanisms fundamentally different from conventional Imperial equipment. Class Alpha designations apply to items that demonstrate obvious biological activity, their organic components maintaining cellular function through unknown metabolic processes. These artifacts require specialized containment procedures that prevent exposure to atmospheric compounds, while simultaneously monitoring for signs of enhanced activity that might indicate attempts to establish neural connections with nearby personnel. The containment protocols emphasize complete isolation from human contact, as even brief exposure to Laer biotechnology can initiate corruption processes that may remain undetectable for extended periods. Class Beta Laer artifacts encompass items that appear dormant but retain the potential for reactivation under specific environmental conditions. These relics require constant monitoring through specialized detection equipment that can identify the subtle biological processes that continue within their organic components even during apparent dormancy. The storage facilities for Beta-class items incorporate atmospheric controls that maintain conditions hostile to biological activity while preventing the complete destruction that might eliminate valuable research opportunities. The protocols recognize that these artifacts could provide crucial intelligence about Laer capabilities, while acknowledging the extreme risks associated with any form of interaction or analysis. The most dangerous classification, Class Omega, applies to Laer artifacts that demonstrate active attempts to establish neural connections with nearby personnel or exhibit signs of conscious intelligence within their biological components. These items require immediate containment within specialized facilities that combine physical isolation with psychic shielding to prevent their corrupting influence from affecting Inquisition personnel. The protocols for handling Omega-class artifacts emphasize that no direct contact should be attempted under any circumstances, as the sophisticated neural interface capabilities of advanced Laer biotechnology can establish corruption pathways through even brief exposure to their influence. Chaos cults throughout Imperial space have adopted practices derived from fragmented knowledge of Laer enhancement techniques, their rituals incorporating biological modification, procedures that promise transcendence through sensory enhancement and physical transformation. These cults typically emerge in populations that have been exposed to Laer artifacts or archaeological sites, their members experiencing visions and revelations that seem to offer pathways to perfection beyond human limitations. The cult practices combine crude understanding of Laer biotechnology with traditional chaos worship, creating hybrid belief systems that emphasize the pursuit of enhanced sensation and aesthetic appreciation as forms of religious devotion. The Crimson Serpent cult that emerged on Hive in the 39th millennium exemplified the dangers posed by these Laer-inspired organizations. The cult's origins traced back to the discovery of a damaged Laer weapon system in the Hive city's industrial sectors, the artifact having been recovered from a derelict spacecraft of unknown origin. The weapon's organic components had entered dormancy during its long journey through space, but exposure to the Hive's atmospheric conditions triggered reactivation processes that began emitting psychoactive compounds into the surrounding environment. The industrial workers who discovered the artifact experienced enhanced sensory perception and aesthetic awareness that seemed to validate their growing obsession with physical beauty and sensory experience. The cult's practices incorporated crude attempts to replicate Laer enhancement techniques using available biological materials and primitive surgical procedures. Members would undergo modifications that attempted to mimic the serpentine characteristics of the original Laer species, though their lack of advanced biotechnology meant that most procedures resulted in death or severe disfigurement rather than successful enhancement. The survivors of these modification attempts demonstrated limited improvements to their sensory capabilities while exhibiting psychological changes that made them completely devoted to the cult's objectives and immune to conventional interrogation techniques. The Crimson Serpent cult's recruitment methods exploited the enhanced sensory experiences available to members who successfully underwent modification procedures. Potential converts were exposed to carefully orchestrated displays of beauty and sensation that demonstrated the transcendent experiences available through cult membership. These recruitment events incorporated primitive versions of the sensory chambers that had characterized Laer civilization, using available technology and biological materials to create environments that induced altered consciousness states in susceptible individuals. The cult's growth accelerated as more Hive citizens sought access to the enhanced experiences that seemed to offer escape from the grinding monotony of industrial labor. The cult's elimination required coordinated action by multiple Imperial agencies, as their biological enhancements made them resistant to conventional suppression techniques. The Adeptus Archives forces deployed against the cult discovered that many members possessed modified nervous systems that allowed them to continue functioning despite injuries that would incapacitate normal humans. Their enhanced pain tolerance and altered psychological responses made them virtually immune to standard interrogation procedures, while their modified sensory organs allowed them to detect approaching law enforcement personnel through means that conventional tactics could not counter. Inquisitor Mordian Vex led the final assault against the cult's primary stronghold, his forces employing specialized weapons designed to disrupt the biological processes that sustain the members' enhancements. The operation revealed the extent to which the cult had transformed sections of the Hive city into organic environments that supported their modified physiology while providing the sensory stimulation they required for psychological stability. The cult's installations incorporated living walls that secreted psychoactive compounds, while their gathering chambers featured biological lighting systems that created the complex visual patterns necessary for their ritual practices. The Ordo Hereticus has documented similar Laer-inspired cults across dozens of Imperial worlds, their emergence typically correlating with the discovery of organic artifacts or exposure to archaeological sites containing dormant Laer biotechnology. These organizations demonstrate remarkable consistency in their practices and beliefs despite developing independently across vast distances and time periods. The similarity suggests that exposure to Laer influence creates predictable psychological and physiological changes that inevitably lead to the formation of cults focused on achieving transcendence through biological enhancement and sensory manipulation. The modern Emperor's Children warband, known as the Flawless Host, continues to embody the corruption that consumed their legion during the Horus Heresy. their practices incorporating techniques derived from their ancestors' exposure to Laer biotechnology and philosophy. The Warband's members undergo extensive modifications that combine traditional chaos mutations with procedures based on fragmentary knowledge of Laer enhancement techniques. These modifications create warriors whose capabilities exceed those of normal Chaos Space Marines, while simultaneously binding them to the Warband's collective consciousness through biological neural networks that facilitate unprecedented coordination during combat operations. Lord Commander Darius Cypher leads the Flawless Host's primary raiding force, his own modifications representing centuries of accumulated enhancements that have transformed him into something barely recognizable as having once been human. His serpentine lower body provides exceptional mobility across varied terrain, while his multiple arms allow him to wield several weapons simultaneously during combat operations. The neural interfaces integrated into his modified anatomy allow him to coordinate the actions of his subordinates through direct consciousness sharing, creating tactical capabilities that exceed anything achievable through conventional command structures. The Warband's recruitment practices involve the systematic corruption of Imperial personnel through exposure to modified versions of the original Demon Blade's influence. They carry lesser artifacts created through procedures that fragment and redistribute portions of the original weapon's consciousness, each relic containing enough demonic essence to initiate corruption processes in susceptible individuals. These weapons serve as vectors for spreading the philosophical and biological influences that characterize the original Laer corruption, though their effects manifest more rapidly and dramatically than the gradual process that affected Fulgrim and his legion during the Great Crusade. The Flawless Host's combat doctrine emphasizes the creation of spectacular displays of martial prowess that serve both tactical and psychological purposes during their raids against Imperial targets. Their enhanced sensory capabilities allow them to appreciate the aesthetic qualities of violence and destruction in ways that provide genuine pleasure and satisfaction, making combat operations sources of entertainment as well as military objectives. This approach to warfare creates psychological trauma in surviving Imperial personnel that extends far beyond the immediate physical damage inflicted during the raids, as witnesses struggle to comprehend enemies who clearly derive intense satisfaction from inflicting suffering and destruction. The Warband's modification techniques have evolved over the millennia to incorporate materials and procedures derived from various sources encountered during their raids and expeditions throughout the galaxy. They harvest biological components from defeated enemies and conquered populations, using these materials to create hybrid enhancements that combine characteristics from multiple species with the underlying Laer-inspired template that governs their transformation processes. These procedures create unique modifications for individual warriors while maintaining the collective identity and shared consciousness that binds the Warband together as a cohesive fighting force. The Inquisition's ongoing efforts to counter Laer-influenced threats require constant vigilance and specialized knowledge that few Imperial personnel possess. The Ordo Xenos maintains detailed databases of known Laer sites and artifacts, though the biological nature of their technology means that new threats can emerge from previously sterilized locations as dormant components reactivate under changing environmental conditions. The protocols for investigating suspected Laer contamination emphasize rapid response and complete containment, as the sophisticated corruption mechanisms employed by their biotechnology can establish influence over Imperial personnel within hours of initial exposure. Inquisitor Cassandra Vorn specializes in Laer-related investigations, her decades of experience providing her with unique insights into the patterns and characteristics that distinguish authentic Laer influence from other forms of xenos or chaos corruption. Her research has revealed that Laer biotechnology operates through mechanisms that specifically target the enhanced psychology of space marines and other augmented humans, exploiting the pride and perfectionist tendencies that characterize these individuals. Her protocols for investigating suspected Laer contamination emphasize the use of unaugmented personnel for initial assessment, as their baseline human psychology provides some protection against the sophisticated manipulation techniques employed by the xenos artifacts. The ongoing discovery of new Laer sites throughout Imperial space suggests that their empire extended far beyond the territories documented during the Great Crusade, with outposts and installations scattered across dozens of sectors that have yet to be fully explored or cataloged. Each new discovery provides opportunities for valuable intelligence gathering, while simultaneously creating risks of contamination that could affect entire planetary populations. The balance between scientific advancement and security concerns continues to challenge Imperial decision-makers as they attempt to derive benefits from Laer technology, while preventing the corruption that inevitably accompanies exposure to their sophisticated biotechnology and seductive philosophy of transcendence through enhancement. The fall of the Laer civilization stands as one of history's most profound cautionary tales about the catastrophic consequences that await those who pursue perfection without moral restraint or spiritual wisdom. Their transformation from accomplished biotechnologists into sensation-obsessed hedonists demonstrates how the noble desire for self-improvement can become a pathway to damnation when divorced from ethical considerations and proper understanding of the forces that govern reality. The Laer's sophisticated mastery of biological manipulation, which initially served practical purposes and enhanced their quality of life, gradually evolved into an all-consuming obsession that corrupted every aspect of their society until they became willing servants of the very entities that would ultimately destroy them. The theological implications of the Laer's downfall resonate deeply with humanity's own struggles against the corrupting influence of chaos, revealing uncomfortable parallels between their civilization's trajectory and the temptations that constantly threaten Imperial society. Both species achieved remarkable technological sophistication and military prowess, yet both proved vulnerable to the seductive promises of transcendence offered by demonic entities that exploited their pride and ambition. The Laer's conviction that their enhanced capabilities made them immune to external corruption mirrors the hubris displayed by countless Imperial commanders, Adeptus Mechanicus researchers, and even Primarchs who believed their superior intellect and willpower provided protection against forces that operate beyond conventional understanding. The demon blade that initiated Fulgrim's corruption represents the most insidious aspect of the Laer's malevolent legacy, demonstrating how their biotechnology could serve as a vector for spiritual contamination that transcended the physical destruction of their civilization. The weapon's sophisticated neural interface capabilities allowed it to establish psychological influence through mechanisms that bypassed conventional defenses against psychic attack, exploiting the target's existing drives and ambitions rather than attempting to impose alien thoughts and desires. This approach proved devastatingly effective because it convinced victims that their corrupted decisions represented natural evolution of their own philosophical inclinations, rather than external manipulation by hostile entities. The blade's corruption of the Emperor's children illustrates how chaos entities can exploit the enhanced psychology of space marines, turning their greatest strengths into vulnerabilities that facilitate spiritual contamination. The Astartes conditioning that normally provided protection against fear, doubt, and external influence became a liability when confronted with corruption that appealed to their pride and perfectionist tendencies. The demon's promise of transcendence through enhancement aligned perfectly with the Legion's existing values, making the gradual transformation seem like logical progression rather than fundamental betrayal of their sacred oaths and imperial doctrine. Modern Imperial scholars studying the Laer phenomenon have identified disturbing patterns that suggest their approach to biological enhancement may have been influenced by the same chaos entities that would later orchestrate the Horus Heresy. The timing of their civilization's transformation from practical biotechnology to sensation-focused hedonism correlates with increased warp storm activity in their region of space, indicating potential exposure to demonic influence during the crucial period when their society was making the transition from utility-focused enhancement to aesthetic-driven modification. This correlation suggests that their fall may have been orchestrated as part of a larger conspiracy designed to create weapons and corruption vectors that could be employed against humanity during the Great Crusade. The theological analysis conducted by the ecclesiarchy's most learned scholars identifies the Laer's pursuit of sensory perfection as a manifestation of the fundamental spiritual error that underlies all forms of chaos corruption. Their civilization's transformation demonstrates how the rejection of natural limitations and divine order inevitably leads to spiritual contamination, as entities attempt to transcend their intended role within the Emperor's grand design for creation. The Laer's conviction that they could achieve godlike perfection through biological manipulation represents the same prideful rebellion against divine authority that characterizes all heretical movements, from the smallest cult uprising to the galaxy-spanning treachery of the Horus Heresy. The ongoing threat posed by surviving Laer artifacts and biotechnological remnants continues to challenge Imperial forces across multiple sectors, their sophisticated corruption mechanisms proving remarkably resistant to conventional containment and destruction procedures. The organic nature of their technology means that apparently destroyed installations can regenerate from microscopic biological components that enter dormant states during adverse conditions, only to reactivate when environmental factors become favorable for renewed growth and expansion. Archaeological teams have discovered Laer sites that show clear evidence of multiple destruction and regeneration cycles, indicating that their biotechnology possesses self-preservation capabilities that exceed anything achieved by purely mechanical systems. The classification protocols developed by the Ordo Xenos for handling Laer materials reflect hard-won understanding of the unique challenges posed by technology that operates through biological processes rather than conventional mechanical or electronic systems. Standard Imperial sterilization procedures prove inadequate against organic components that can survive extreme temperatures, radiation exposure, and chemical treatments that would destroy normal biological tissue. The most effective containment methods involve complete atmospheric isolation combined with specialized biological agents designed to disrupt cellular processes at the molecular level, though even these measures cannot guarantee permanent neutralization of particularly sophisticated specimens. Inquisition records dozens of contamination incidents involving Imperial personnel who believed themselves capable of safely studying Laer artifacts without succumbing to their corrupting influence. These cases consistently demonstrate that exposure to even dormant Laer biotechnology can initiate subtle psychological changes that remain undetectable for extended periods, while gradually reshaping the victim's priorities and decision-making processes. The sophisticated neural interface capabilities that characterized advanced Laer weapons and tools allow them to establish influence pathways through minimal physical contact, creating corruption vectors that can affect multiple individuals through secondary exposure to contaminated personnel. The Adeptus Mechanicus has developed specialized protocols for investigating sites containing potential Laer technology, emphasizing the use of remote sensing equipment and automated systems to minimize direct human exposure to potentially corrupted materials. These procedures acknowledge that the Omnissiah's protection may prove insufficient against corruption mechanisms that operate through biological rather than purely technological vectors, requiring unprecedented cooperation between the Mechanicus and other Imperial organizations that possess expertise in countering Xenos' influence. The protocols represent a significant departure from standard Mechanicus doctrine, which typically emphasizes direct study and analysis of recovered technology regardless of potential risks to investigating personnel. The lessons learned from humanity's encounters with Laer corruption have influenced imperial military doctrine regarding the investigation and containment of xenos artifacts discovered during compliance operations and archaeological expeditions. Modern field manuals emphasize that sophisticated alien civilizations may have developed corruption mechanisms specifically designed to affect enhanced humans, requiring specialized countermeasures that go beyond conventional NBC protection and psychic shielding. The protocols stress that pride and confidence in one's own incorruptibility represent the greatest vulnerabilities when confronting enemies that exploit psychological weaknesses rather than attempting direct assault on physical or spiritual defenses. The Emperor's Children's transformation from one of the most disciplined and effective Space Marine legions into willing servants of chaos demonstrates how even the most rigorously conditioned warriors can succumb to corruption that appeals to their fundamental nature and core values. Their fall serves as a permanent reminder that no individual or organization, regardless of their achievements or spiritual preparation, can consider themselves immune to the insidious influence of entities that have spent millennia perfecting their understanding of human psychology and motivation. The Legion's corruption began with seemingly innocent appreciation for alien aesthetic achievements and evolved through gradual stages that each appeared reasonable and beneficial when considered in isolation from the larger pattern of spiritual contamination. The theological implications of the Laer legacy extend beyond simple warnings about the dangers of xenos contact to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of perfection and humanity's proper relationship with enhancement and modification technologies. The Emperor's vision for human evolution clearly anticipated significant augmentation of baseline human capabilities, as demonstrated by the creation of the Primarchs and the Space Marine legions. However, the Laer example illustrates the crucial distinction between enhancement that serves divine purpose and modification pursued for its own sake without regard for spiritual consequences or moral implications. Imperial doctrine now recognizes that the pursuit of perfection must be balanced against the recognition of humanity's proper place within the Emperor's grand design, acknowledging that attempts to transcend natural limitations without divine guidance inevitably lead to corruption and spiritual contamination. The Laer's fate demonstrates that technological sophistication and biological mastery provide no protection against the fundamental spiritual dangers that accompany prideful rebellion against divine authority. Their civilization's achievements in biotechnology and aesthetic refinement became meaningless once they abandoned the moral and spiritual principles that should have guided their development and constrained their ambitions. The continuing emergence of Laer-inspired cults throughout Imperial space indicates that their corrupting philosophy retains the power to influence human populations even in the absence of direct exposure to their artifacts or biotechnology. These organizations typically develop among populations that have been exposed to fragmentary knowledge of Laer enhancement techniques, their members seeking to achieve transcendence through crude attempts to replicate alien modification procedures. The consistency of their practices and beliefs across vast distances and time periods suggests that exposure to Laer influence creates predictable psychological changes that inevitably manifest in similar patterns of behavior and worship. The modern threat posed by Chaos Space Marines, who have incorporated Laer-inspired enhancement techniques into their corruption practices, demonstrates how the alien civilization's malevolent legacy continues to serve the forces of chaos long after their physical destruction. Warbands like the Flawless Host represent the ultimate fusion of human ambition with alien corruption, their members having undergone modifications that combine the worst aspects of both chaos mutation and Laer biotechnology. These warriors serve as living reminders of the catastrophic consequences that await those who pursue perfection through forbidden means, their enhanced capabilities purchased at the cost of their humanity and spiritual integrity. The Inquisition's ongoing efforts to counter Laer-influenced threats require constant vigilance and specialized knowledge that few Imperial personnel possess, as the sophisticated nature of their corruption mechanisms continues to challenge conventional understanding of how alien influence operates. The biological basis of their technology means that traditional methods for detecting and countering xenos contamination may prove inadequate against threats that operate through mechanisms fundamentally different from purely technological or psychic vectors. The development of effective countermeasures requires unprecedented cooperation between multiple Imperial organizations, each contributing specialized expertise to address different aspects of the multifaceted threat posed by Laer legacy systems. The ultimate lesson of the Laer civilization's rise and fall lies not merely in the specific dangers posed by their particular form of biotechnology, but in the broader spiritual principles that their fate illustrates about the nature of corruption and the importance of maintaining proper humility before the divine order established by the Emperor. Their story serves as an eternal warning that no achievement, no matter how impressive or beneficial it may appear, justifies the abandonment of moral principles or the pursuit of transcendence through means that violate the natural order. The galaxy's history is littered with civilizations that believed their sophistication and capabilities made them immune to the fundamental spiritual laws that govern all existence, yet each discovered too late that pride and ambition provide no protection against the consequences of their choices. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where humanity faces constant threats from alien enemies, heretical cults, and demonic entities, the example of the Laer stands as a permanent reminder that the greatest dangers often come not from external foes, but from the corruption that can take root within the human soul when it abandons the guidance and protection offered by faith in the Emperor. Their fate demonstrates that the pursuit of perfection, when divorced from proper spiritual understanding and moral restraint, becomes a pathway to damnation that leads inevitably to the very destruction it sought to transcend. The Laer achieved everything they believed they desired, yet in doing so, they lost everything that truly mattered, leaving behind only cursed artifacts and corrupted knowledge that continue to threaten the faithful servants of the Imperium, who must remain forever vigilant against the seductive promises of transcendence through forbidden enhancement.